The Fog by James Herbert. Read by Christopher Lee. Chapter 1. The village slowly began to come to life. Slowly, because nothing ever happened with speed in that part of Wiltshire. Newcomers welcomed the leisurely pace and protective quiet of the village. The occasional tourist, delighted in its weathered charm, then moved on, a little afraid of the boredom it might bring. Jessie opened her grocery shop at precisely 8:30, as she had been doing for the past 20 years. Even when Tom, her late husband, had died, the shop had still been opened on the dot of 8:30. Her first customer was Mrs. Thackeray, who had been a great comfort since Tom had died, and never missed her morning cup of tea with Jessie. She waved to Mr. Papworth, the butcher across the street, who was sweeping the pavement. Man, Mr. Papworth, much nicer since his wife had left him after 6 years of marriage, and she hadn't been his sort anyway. Much too young for him, too flighty. Still, all that was in the past. They were becoming more frequent, and the whole village knew that the butcher's and grocery shop would eventually become a combined family business. There was no rush. Things would take their course. "Good morning, Mrs. Bundock," said two young voices in unison. She smiled down at little Freddie Gravies and his small sister Clara. "I'm surprised to see you two today. Saturday's usually your pocket money day, isn't it?" "Yes, but we polished all Daddy's boots yesterday, so he gave us a spade," was Freddie's reply. Their father was a policeman who adored his two children but dealt with them strictly. "Well, what are you going to buy?" Jessie asked, knowing that they couldn't have much to spend. Clara pointed to the penny chews, and Freddie nodded in agreement. "3 each, please," he said. "Well now, penny chews are cheaper on Mondays. You get 4 each for 6p today." They beamed up at her as she took out the sweets. "Thank you," said Clara as she put them in her pocket. Freddie gave Jessie the money, and they ran from the shop, Freddie clutching Clara's hand. "Morning, Jessie." It was the postman. "Hello, Tom. Something for me?" "Air mail. Suspect it's from your boy," he replied, handing her the blue and red envelope. "Been in the army nearly a year now, hasn't he?" She nodded a little sadly as she began to read the letter. "Oh, well, Jessie, a young boy like Andy couldn't stay cooped up in a village like this all his life, could he? Having the time of his life now, I reckon." "Yes, I suppose you're right, but I do miss him. He was a good boy." The postman shrugged his shoulders. "Well, must be off, Jessie." "Yes, bye, Tom." A smile spread across her face as she went on reading. Andy's natural boisterousness shone through the written words. She felt giddy and lurched against the counter, alarmed at the strange, stomach-rising feeling. Then she heard a deep rumbling noise from below, under her feet, and the floor began to quiver. The rumbling grew louder, deeper. Now the whole shop seemed to be moving. The large glass window cracked and then fell in. Shelves collapsed. The noise became deafening. Jessie screamed. She stumbled, then crawled towards the doorway, terror of the building collapsing in on her, forcing her on. Vibrations ran through her body, at times the shaking almost making her lose contact with the floor. She reached the door and looked out at the road that ran through the village. The postman stood in the middle of the road, holding onto his bike. A huge crack appeared at his feet, and suddenly, as the ground opened up, he disappeared. The crack snaked along the length of the street to where young Freddie and Clara stood transfixed, and on towards Mrs. Thackeray, who had been making her way to Jessie's shop. Then the road disappeared, as the ground opened up like a gigantic yawning mouth. As Jessie looked, she just caught sight of the terrified face of Mr. Papworth, as he and the whole row of shops and houses on his side were swallowed up by the earth. Chapter 2. Wearily changed gear to take the car around the bend in the narrow country road. He was unshaved, and his clothes were still damp from the morning dew. He'd spent half the night trying to sleep inside a thicket of sight of the army patrols that practiced on the wooded part of Salisbury Plain. The area was owned by the Ministry of Defence, and trespassers were severely dealt with if caught. Homan shook his head in disgust at the danger and discomfort he'd had to go through to maintain secrecy when he himself worked for the same government. It was idiotic that the two departments, the Ministry of Defense and the Department of the Environment, couldn't work hand in hand, from polluted rivers to outbreaks of disease. It was a special unit because nearly all the investigations were carried out secretly. If a company was suspected of illegally dumping dangerous waste product, be it into the sea, into a river, or onto a tip, but no proof could be found by direct methods, then Homan was sent in to probe further. He usually worked alone and often under a cover. His one big frustration was that the transgressions he unearthed were not always acted upon. When politics, business, or governmental became involved, he knew the chances of prosecution against the offenders were slim. At 32, Homan was still young enough to be angered by that fact. However, he could also be quite unscrupulous in achieving his aims, and more than once had caused alarm among the few superiors who knew about his activities. At the moment, his project was to investigate land owned by the Ministry of Defense, used by them as a training ground for the army. Homan knew that much of it was going to waste, areas of great natural beauty, rich arable soil, being allowed to spoil. The Ministry of Defense was holding tightly on to over 750,000 acres for training or test purposes, and his department suspected that only a fraction of it was necessary. So Homan had been given the job of seeing just how much land was being used, and if for valid purposes. He had spent 2 rigorous days dodging patrols, taking photographs, gathering information about the enormous woodland area owned by the Ministry on Salisbury Plain. Had he been caught, the consequences could have been quite severe, but he knew the risk involved and enjoyed the element of danger. Now, as he rounded the bend, he saw a village ahead. Maybe he could get some breakfast here, he thought. He drew nearer, and suddenly became aware of a strange vibration running through the car, then of a deep rumbling noise. A gigantic crack appeared directly ahead of him, then grew long up, and they disappeared. Through his horror, he realized that the ground below his car was beginning to split. He opened the door, but too late. The car began to fall, and Homan was trapped inside. After a few sickening seconds, the car became wedged, and he found himself pressed up against the steering wheel, staring down into a frightening black void. Slowly, his brain began to function. He must be at the end of the opening, where the sides were narrowest. If it widened further, the car would plunge into the black depths below. Panic drove him into action. He frantically pushed himself away from the steering wheel, but the sudden movement caused the car to slide, a terrifying 2 feet farther down. More cautiously, he began to edge himself over into the back seat. He froze as the car shifted again, but this time the movement was fractional. He wound down a rear side window and saw that there was just sufficient gap between the car and the side of the chasm for him to see through. He scrambled through and clung to the crumbling wall of rock and earth for a full 5 minutes. Then he looked around him fearfully. From the jagged outline above, he guessed the eruption was at least 500 yards long. The sides seemed steady now, although earth still showered down into what seemed a bottomless pit. He heard a sudden cry and saw a tiny figure lying on a narrow ledge about 50 feet away. It was the little girl he'd seen in the street above. Of the boy who'd been with her, there was no sign. She began to whimper piteously. Homan called out to her, then looked around. The problem was to get across the gorge to her, and quickly. The car would have to act as a bridge. Before allowing himself to think further, he put his foot on the roof and took 2 bounds across the gap. But the second step caused the car to slip down, taking Homan with it. Desperately, he grabbed at a dead tree root, and it swung him inwards. Homan managed to find a handhold, then raised his feet until they found a more solid rest. Gulping in lungfuls of dusty air, he looked towards the little girl. He knew she would not last long on the precarious ledge. Again, the thought of the ground closing up drove him on, and he inched forward. He felt his way along carefully, and as he drew nearer, the child's sobbing stopped, and she looked up at him, a tiny face, a mask of sheer horror. It's okay, he said, softly but urgently. I'm coming to help you. Don't move. She began to back away and slid down suddenly. Homan took a chance and lurched forward, hoping the side of the ledge would hold his weight. His left hand found a crevice in the wall, and he clung to it grimly, stretching out his other hand to the girl. She was screaming now, but her hand grabbed his as she realized the danger. "Hold on to me, sweetheart," he told her gently. "Put your arms around my neck and hold tight." He pulled her down between the ledge and his body, telling her to put her legs around his waist. Numbly, she complied, her short legs resting on his hips. "Now don't let go and everything will be fine," he whispered, easing himself back along the crack to the more solid outcrop of rock. He sank to his knees, still holding the child close, exhausted. After a few minutes, he began to wonder at what had happened, what had caused it. It certainly wasn't any gas mains explosion, not with this devastation. The hole was too deep, too long. No, it must have been an earth tremor. But why? Had the nearby military installation been testing some underground explosives? Well, probably it had nothing to do with them. It was more likely to be a freak of nature, a disturbance below that had been building up for centuries. But still, the doubt lingered. Just then, Homan noticed a yellowish mist slowly rising in a sluggish, swirling motion. As it covered the girl's head, she started to cough. Then the mist reached his nostrils. It had a slightly acidy smell to it, unpleasant, but not choking. It was above his head now, and he found it difficult to see through. It was like a fog. His horror grew. Somehow it seemed evil and sinister. He didn't know why, but it filled him with a sense of foreboding. "Help! Is there anybody up there? Can anyone hear me?" There was no answer. The child burst into tears again, burying her head into his shoulder. Moving her around to his back, he began to climb. The people above heard the cry for help. They gained new heart at the sound of a voice, a chance to react against the tragedy. The policeman, whose children were thought to have been lost in the eruption, was lowered over the edge of the crack. When he emerged 5 minutes later, he held a small, unconscious girl in his arms. He laid her on the ground and dashed back to the hole and was lowered again. This time he brought up a man covered from head to foot with dust and dirt, a man who gibbered and screamed, a man who had to be restrained by 4 others from running back and throwing himself into the black depths, a man who was insane. The villagers watched the mist rising from the hole to form a heavy yellowish cloud. Then the winds blew it away, moving it in a huge, almost solid-looking mass across the sky, away from the ruined village. Chapter 3. The Reverend Martin Hurdle trudged across the fields, his thoughts on the peaceful little village that had virtually been demolished by the freak earthquake. It had been the main story in the newspapers all that week. He shrugged his shoulders helplessly. He usually enjoyed his early Sunday morning walk across the fields, planning his sermon, but he supposed the tragedy of the eruption still bore heavily on him. He'd driven to the village to try to help, to administer the last rites to the dying, to comfort the injured. He looked up from the ground abruptly, realizing he'd walked into a mist. It had a yellowish tinge to it, and was suddenly very thick as it swept over him. Strange smell, too. Goodness, he thought, better retrace my steps and get clear of this. He walked back in the direction he'd come, for some reason becoming nervous as his steps didn't bring him clear of the dense mist. No, it wasn't a mist, he thought. It was fog, as bad as some of the old London pea soupers. Goodness, he muttered aloud, I'm lost. What was that? His heart pounded as a dark, nebulous shape approached him, followed by another. Then he laughed. He had walked into a herd of cows. It took him a full 5 minutes to recover his wits, frightened by a herd of cows. He'd certainly learned a lesson today. The unknown was always more fearful than the reality. It took him another 20 minutes to find his way clear of the fog. The man crouched low in the bushes when he heard a rustle of leaves to his left. Human or animal? Tom Abbott had to be careful. If he was caught poaching on Colonel Meredith's land again, he'd be in serious trouble. Last time the colonel had spotted him hiding in the bushes and used his thick walking stick to beat him about the head and shoulders. The poacher crept forward again, still cursing the landowner in his mind, peering into the bushes ahead. He froze. Yes, there was something there, and not a man. Another pheasant, I'll warrant, Tom told himself. He kept perfectly still, not wanting to frighten it away, to let it come out in its own time. He crouched there for a full 10 minutes before he became aware of a solid blanket of fog almost on top of him. Soon he was completely enveloped in it. Then he heard the sound of something scampering away. He cursed aloud and stood up. Ah, well, one was better than nothing. He walked back through the fog. He knew the area so well he could find his way back blindfold. The Sunday morning service began as normal, pleasurable to some, boring others, but today, because of the tragedy, meaningful for most. A few people near the front noticed the vicar occasionally put his hand to his forehead, as though he were tired or had a headache, but the service continued smoothly enough until the sermon. Then the Reverend Martin Hurdle, vicar of St. Augustine's for 18 years, lifted his cassock and exposed himself to his congregation. "Now, where have all those blessed cows got to?" George Ross, a farmer, asked himself aloud. He stood looking around, then his mouth dropped open at the sight of the fog at the other end of his field. "Well, I'll be! Never noticed that." He began to walk towards the murky cloud and grinned as he saw the cows emerging from it. "Trust you!" he shouted at them. "Stupid bloody creatures!" Funny having a fog down here, he pondered. Too heavy to be a mist. All this blooming pollution. The cows were up to him now, and the leaders passed him. Then suddenly they all stopped and turned towards him, watching. "What's this, then?" For some inexplicable reason he had begun to feel nervous. Then they began to close in on him. He heard a pounding of hooves and felt himself pushed from behind. He fell to the ground and scrambled about on his hands and knees, trying to rise. He began to scream as the cows started to kick him. They were racing round him, their eyes bulging almost out of their sockets, froth and slime running from their mouths. Then they began to bite him, snapping off his fingers as he raised his arms to protect himself. When at last he lay sprawled semi-conscious, they herded together and crushed the life from his battered body with their hooves. The poacher gazed at the colonel's huge country home from his hiding place in the bushes. After a while he rose and crept stealthily towards a wooden hut at the end of the long garden. He pushed open the door, his eyes now developing a fixed stare, his movements controlled, steady. He reached for an axe, rusted with time, but the blade still sharp. As he turned to leave the hut, his gaze fell on a box of 3-inch nails used for fencing. He put some of them in his pocket. He walked back up the garden in a straight line towards the house, not bothering to hide. As he reached the back door, the Meredith's cook was just opening it to let the steam from her kitchen escape. She had no chance to scream before the axe hit her, for in the next instant she was dead. Tom Abbott climbed the stairs to the hall, and the sound of voices drew him towards the dining room. He stood still when he heard footsteps. The maid hummed to herself as she descended the stairs. "Put the kettle on, Mrs. Peabody," she called out as she approached the kitchen door. Discovering the kitchen empty, she looked around curiously. She walked to the open door, and a scream broke from her lips as she saw the cook's body lying there just outside the doorway, its skull cleaved open to the bridge of the nose. As she collapsed, the maid's brain just registered the other scream, the scream from upstairs that pierced the still air. When she regained consciousness, she ran to the dining room, trying to call out. There, she stopped short at the sight confronting her. Her mistress lay sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood, and the colonel lay spread-eagled on the huge dining table, long nails through the palms of his hands and the flesh of his ankles to pin him there. A man stood over him, an axe dripping with blood in his hands. The maid was unable to move with the horror of it. She saw the man raise the axe above his head and bring it down with all his strength, severing a hand. By the time he'd cut off the other hand, the colonel was unconscious. By the time he'd hacked off both feet, the colonel was dead. The maid finally began to scream when the man with the axe turned his head and looked at her. Chapter 4. "Hello, John." John Homan smiled up at the girl. "Hello, Casey." He was sitting on the steps of the hospital, unwilling to wait inside. He found hospitals depressing. "They said you'd need at least another couple of weeks." She sat next to him on the steps. "No, I'm all right now. Any longer in there and I'd have gone mad again." She flinched at the words, remembering how he had been the first time she'd visited. He hadn't been the man she knew and loved. He was an animal, a foul-mouthed, raging animal, tied to a bed. Casey had left in a daze, tears blurring her vision. Casey's wretchedness had increased that evening when she visited Homan again. The doctor felt that she should know about the young child rescued with him who had died that afternoon without ever coming out of the unusual coma she'd been in since the eruption. They now thought that she had been affected by gas released from below the ground. It was possible that Homan also had been affected, and this in some strange way was the cause of his madness. The next few days would tell if the brain damage was permanent or would pass, or if the effects were fatal. She hardly slept that night. She had known Homan for nearly a year now, and was becoming aware that she would be lost without him. But when she returned to the hospital in the morning, dread in her heart, Homan was completely sane, weak, ashen-faced, but totally sane. And 1 week later, he was ready to go home. Now, sitting beside him, Casey took Homan's hand and asked, "Are you sure it's all right for you to leave the hospital so soon?" "Oh, they wanted me to stay, but I've had enough. Yesterday, Spires came down to interrogate me." Spires was Homan's immediate boss at his ministry. "What did he want to know?" asked Casey. "Whether I'd completed my weekend's assignment." He couldn't tell her that Spires had come to find out if he had found any evidence that could connect the earthquake with experiments being carried out on the military base. Homan thought it unlikely and had no such proof anyway. "I've got to report to him tomorrow. Then I'm on a week's leave." "I should think so too, after all you've been through." "Yes, but honestly, I feel fine now. Now, come on, let's leave before I go out of my mind again." He laughed at her frown. It was just before Way Hill that they ran into the fog again. "Strange," said Homan, stopping the car. "Is it smoke or just a mist?" "Oh, it's too heavy for mist," replied Casey. "It's fog. It's creepy." They both jumped as a school bus sped past them, heading towards Way Hill. "Bloody fool," muttered Homan. "He's heading right into it." They watched as it was swallowed up by the fog. They suddenly realized the fog had crept much nearer to them. "Christ, it moved fast," said Homan. "Come on, then, it'll be okay if I take it easy." He drove on, and very soon they entered the fog. As the slightly acrid smell reached Homan's nostrils, a tiny nerve twitched in his memory cells. He broke into a cold sweat and stopped the car. "What's the matter, John?" Casey asked, alarmed. "Why, I don't know. The fog, it seems familiar." "John, the papers said a cloud of dust or smoke came from the eruption. They thought it had been caused by a blast beneath the ground. Perhaps this is it." "Maybe it is, but let's try and get clear." He edged the car forward, peering ahead into the gloom. They'd made 100 yards, slow progress, when they came upon the school bus lying half in a ditch. Homan climbed out of the car, telling Casey to remain inside. The slight but distinct odor of the fog disturbed him again as he closed the car door behind him. "Is anyone hurt?" he asked the spectral shape of the man he assumed was the boy's master. "I'm afraid our driver suffered a nasty blow on the head," said the teacher. "Well, let's have a look at him," said Homan. "Maybe I can help." They walked to the front of the coach, where they found the driver sitting on the grass. Some boys stood around him, watching curiously. "Now, Mr. Hodges, how are we feeling?" asked the teacher. "Bloody awful," came the muffled reply. The boys tittered, and the teacher ordered them to go to the back of the coach and stay out of the road. Homan looked carefully at the gash on the driver's head. He turned to the teacher. "I don't think it's serious, but we'll take him to a doctor and inform the police at the same time. They'll arrange other transport for the boys. Are any of them hurt?" "No, they're all right, thank you." As they helped the injured Hodges back to the car, the teacher explained the coach journey. "We're from Redbrook House, a private boarding school in Andover. We're on our way back from a nature ramble on the plain, you know. I cannot imagine where this fog came from." Homan cast an anxious eye around him. The fog seemed as dense as ever. As they approached the car, Casey opened her door. "Don't get out!" he shouted. He opened the door on his side and helped the injured man to climb into the back. And then he turned to the teacher. "If I were you, I'd get all those boys back into the coach and keep the doors and windows closed. I'll get someone back to you as soon as possible, so just sit tight." As Homan cautiously moved off, he still wasn't quite sure why he was so uneasy about the fog. The doctors had said his breakdown could have been caused in some way by released gas from the cracked earth, and that smell had seemed familiar somehow. He slowed to crawling pace as the fog became thicker. "John, what's that? I thought I saw something white shining through the fog, but it vanished almost immediately," said Casey. Their passenger suddenly said, "Nice peaceful summer we had, I don't think. Bloody earthquake of all things, here in Wiltshire." He groaned in pain, and then his voice rose. "And then yesterday, do you hear about the axe murders? Happened fairly near the earthquake village and all. Colonel something or other murdered with his wife and all his staff, cook and a maid. Done him with an axe, and the bloke what done it chopped at his own wrists until he bled to death." Hodges groaned again. "How much further?" For another slow 15 minutes they were immersed in the dense fog, and then suddenly they were clear. Homan picked up some speed. The village police station was soon reached. The police sergeant couldn't quite understand Homan's anxiety when he learned that none of the boys was seriously hurt, and he was almost disbelieving about the fog. Nevertheless, he said he would send one of his men out there right away. When Homan left the police station, he had a faint feeling of dissatisfaction. Now that he was in the bright sunshine, the fog seemed unreal, as though it had never really happened. Was his mind still a bit disturbed? Did he really think this fog had something to do with his own recent illness? Homan shrugged off his thoughts and drove the still grumbling Hodges to the doctor's surgery. There they left him, and then drove on to London. Chapter 5. A few hours later, they reached Homan's flat in St. John's Wood Road. Casey made him a coffee while he slumped in a chair. "How do you feel now, John?" she asked gently. "Oh, a little tired, that's all. Post-hospital depression, I think it's called." After a pause, she said, "I discovered a lot of things about myself when you were in hospital, John. The most important being that I love you more than I could have imagined possible." He leaned closer to her, taking her face in his hands, saying nothing. "The way you were," she continued, "things you said, it frightened me. It was like a nightmare. And then I went back to the hospital the next day, and they told me that you might die. I realized I'd be nothing without you. I don't want to leave you. Let me stay for at least tonight," she begged. He kissed her lips, suddenly laughing at her sorrowful face. "Okay, Casey," he said, "you've got a deal." Gradually, Homan began to relax. He looked down at her and said suddenly, "Let's go to bed." Homan strolled along Marsham Street, enjoying the bustle. He entered the gloom of the large environment building and took the lift to the 8th floor. "Hello, John." His colleague McClellan, a cheerful Scot with only a trace of accent, greeted him. "Spires wants to see you as soon as possible." "I'm glad you're okay, by the way. You take it easy." "Sure, Mac, thank you." Homan climbed the stairs to the 9th floor to Spires' office. Spires looked up from his papers, peering at him through thick-lensed glasses. "Ah, John, feeling okay? Good. Now, first, I'd like you to tell me again about the earthquake, right from the beginning." Homan told as much as he could remember, but his mind went blank at the point where he had rescued the girl. Spires leaned forward. "Think, John, did you hear an explosion before the ground opened?" "You see," he said, "a cloud of smoke was reported rising up out of the ground just after they'd brought you up." "You think there was an explosion then?" "I didn't hear one." "Possibly." "Connected with a military base?" "Certainly not. The Ministry of Defense would never be as irresponsible as to have caused a disaster like this." "You suspect something, don't you?" he asked Spires quietly. Spires spoke wearily. "Look, I've been on to the Ministry of Defense. There is a massive clampdown in security. I don't know if it means anything, and I'm powerless if it does." A strange, vacant look came into his eyes, and his voice trailed off. "What's wrong?" Homan asked, concerned. "What—" He broke off as Spires rose from his chair, walked to the window, and opened it. He turned to look at the surprised younger man, then he climbed onto the sill. Before Homan could make a move towards him, he jumped out. Homan was stunned. Then, shouting Spires' name, he rushed to the window. He saw the crumpled figure lying on the pavement 9 floors below, a pool of blood spreading swiftly from beneath the smashed head. Homan drew in a long, uneven breath. He turned back in towards the room and saw Spires' secretary standing in the doorway, a frightened look on her face. He jumped, Homan managed to say at last. Homan sank into the chair Spires had occupied only moments ago and sat staring at the desktop. What had happened? Why had he jumped? The feeling came over Homan again, the sense of skin crawling, the feeling he'd had when they'd entered the fog. He sprang to his feet and pushed past the startled people crowding into the office. He had to get to Casey. Chapter 6. Redbrook House stood in its own grounds in one of the quieter roads in Andover, a school for the privileged classes. 5 years before, the headmaster, Hayward, had taken on a deputy headmaster in hope of breathing new life into the school. Mr. Summers came highly recommended by one of the governing committee's members. He'd been a captain in the army during World War II and had lost an arm in the course of it. Although Hayward was disappointed by his assistant's narrow-minded educational theories, he had to admit that the man was generally very competent. But his constant carping was becoming increasingly irritating. Summers had turned the business of the crashed coach into a major issue, demanding Hodges' instant dismissal. When Hayward had confronted the wretched-looking driver, who acted as janitor, gardener, and performed countless other tasks around the school, he had admitted it was his fault, but had gone on in a surly tone to imply certain notions about the deputy head. It was because of these implications that Hayward had decided to sack Hodges, not because of the misadventure in the fog. As for Summers, Hayward would certainly keep an eye on him. It was such a pity he had to get rid of Hodges, thought Hayward with a sigh, but good teachers were harder to replace than odd-job men. Hodges had almost reached the main gate when he suddenly stopped. He stared down at the shears without comprehension. He opened and closed them with one sharp, snapping movement, then slowly walked back towards the school. He entered the old building, and as he walked down the corridor, he caught sight through the open doorway to the playground of a black-gowned figure walking briskly towards the gymnasium. The stump of one arm at its side told him who it was. He followed. The boys had stopped halfway through the P.E. exercises, leaving Osborne, their burly physical training master, jumping on the spot alone, arms and legs snapping, in, out. Osborne finally stopped his prancing and glared at the boys. "Who told you to stop?" he thundered at them. "Well?" The boys just stared. "What's the game, Jenkins?" he demanded of the blank-faced boy before him. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came from them. He pushed roughly past him to the next boy, one of his personal favorites. "Come on, Clark, what's all this about, huh?" Clark stared at the teacher as though he'd never seen him before. All right, you've had your little prank, but I'm going to give you 5 seconds to get weaving again." He strode into the middle of them. 1, 2, 3... He failed to notice Clark, now behind him, walk towards a cricket bat lying on one of the benches at the side of the gym. Clark picked up the bat and walked back with it towards the angry teacher. 4, this is your last chance." As his lips formed the word 5, Clark raised the bat high and brought it crashing down on the back of Osborne's head. He sank to the ground, still conscious but painfully stunned. He sprawled forward as the bat landed again, blood now running down his neck, staining his blue tracksuit. The boys surged forward as one, stamping on the limp man with plimsolled feet. They pulled the tracksuit off, so Osborne was completely naked, then dragged him towards the wall bars. The bars were of the type that swung away from the wall when in use, so that climbing ropes hung from the tops of their frames. The boys lifted Osborne and viciously pushed him back against the bars, 2 climbing either side of him to loop the hanging ropes through the wooden bars, and lashing his wrists to them high above his head. Then his feet were pushed through the lower rungs so that they were trapped by the ankles. While some spat, kicked, punched, or just jeered at the hanging man, others ran towards the huge sports chest and brought out wicket stumps, skipping ropes, more bats. Then, in turn, they began to beat him with the wicket stumps, lashing him with the wooden ends of the skipping ropes, striking him with the bats. One of the stronger boys systematically hit at Osborne's kneecaps and private parts. The boys all bore the same animal look of madness on their faces, their eyes wide, their mouths slack and drooling, the insane excitement of their actions making them scarcely human, all except one. One small boy, crouched, shivering in a far corner, too terrified to run away, too paralyzed to take his eyes off the incredible scene taking place. A boy who had not been allowed to accompany the others on their coach trip the day before because he was recovering from an illness. Summers reached the gymnasium and paused. The pain in his head was becoming more severe. He opened the door and stopped again, this time with shock. The boys, most of them naked, were milling around something red and pink hanging from the wall bars. Then he realized it was Osborne, surely dead. He saw the damage they had done to the obscene-looking body, the beating they had dealt it. He saw the boys watching him. His boys. He suddenly felt a stirring in a region that had lain dormant for so many years. He shook his head jerkily, then a smile formed on his lips. He strode forward towards the silent boys. "Yes," he said urgently. "Yes, yes." Hodges went into the gymnasium, still holding the shears. There was no reaction on his face as his eyes fell upon the bizarre scene before him. 2 men were tied to the wall bars on the far wall. One hung still and quiet, and the other squirmed and moaned, not with pain, but with the pleasure pain brought. Hodges slowly raised the shears. "Yes, yes!" Summers cried, his whole body now quivering with excitement. The boys watched in silence as the blades snapped together, and the scream echoed around the gymnasium. Chapter 7. Holman reached the door of his flat, fumbling for the key, trying to calm himself, only too willing to appear foolish if Casey was perfectly all right. He opened the door, and a chill ran through him as he saw the place in darkness. "Casey?" Silence. He stepped into the bedroom and walked towards the bed. Only the harsh, dry chuckle he heard behind him saved his life. He whirled around at the sound, the movement causing the kitchen knife Casey was plunging down towards his back to miss. She stood before him, familiar, but a stranger. Her eyes were cold, her mouth was drawn back in a grimace. She plunged down once more with the knife, but this time Holman was ready. He stepped back and tried to grab her wrist, but missed. As the knife swept up again, he caught her arm and moved in towards her. Suddenly she brought her knee up full into his groin. He doubled up, his grip on her wrist weakening considerably. She pulled it free and sprang away from him. Now she knelt on the bed beside him as he gasped for air, and raised the knife above her head again, holding it with both hands. The sight made him forget his pain, and he kicked out viciously, sending her crashing off the bed. The knife lay somewhere in the gloom. Holman couldn't see where. She leapt towards him, fingers clawing to tear at his eyes. They rolled over on the bed, their bodies becoming entangled in the bedclothes. They fell to the floor, taking the bedclothes with them, landing in a struggling heap. She dodged him and brought the bedside lamp crashing down towards his head. He fell back against the side of the bed, the restraint of not wanting to hurt her now completely gone from his mind. He would have to fight her as he would fight a man or a mad dog. He saw her grab for something on the floor and realized it must be the knife. Suddenly she ran forward, raising the knife high with a scream of anticipation. He ducked beneath the descending arm and was behind her. As she whirled, he reached the door, grabbed the handle, and twisted his body to slam it shut behind him. He heard the thunk of the knife as it sank into the wood, then the thud of her body as it followed through and struck the door. He immediately pushed the door open again, all his strength behind the thrust, the whole action in one fluid movement. It slammed into the girl, knocking her back violently. She fell to the floor and lay there gasping. At the sight of her lying there moaning, his rage vanished. He knelt beside her and cradled her in his arms, tenderly rocking her to and fro. "Oh, Casey, I'm sorry, darling," he said softly, forgetting her madness, thinking only of the pain he had caused her. But even as he held her and her breathing became more even, he could feel her body stiffening, her whimpers becoming low murmurings of insane anger. Hastily he tied her hands with the rolled-up sheet, and then, without warning, her body went limp, and her eyes became glazed as though she were in a deep cataleptic trance. Lifting her gently, he took her over to the bed and laid her on it, propping her head up with 2 pillows. He sat there in the gloom, staring at the girl. How much had the gas, the fog, whatever it was, how much had it affected her? Would she ever be normal again? Would she try to kill herself, as Spires had done? His only hope was that Casey had not been exposed too much. She'd been inside the car most of the time. Was such a short exposure still as lethal? He was still sitting there in the semi-darkness when the police pounded on the door 10 minutes later. Homan went to the door quickly, afraid to leave Casey alone for too long. He was surprised to see the police. There were two, one uniformed, the other in plain clothes. "John Homan?" the man in plain clothes asked brusquely. "I'm Detective Inspector Barrow. We understand that you were the only witness present at an accident at the Department of the Environment building a short while ago." The detective glanced around the flat, visibly puzzled by the absence of daylight. "Yes, that's right. My boss committed suicide, but—" "Why did you leave?" The detective was walking away from him, opening doors and looking in as he went. Then, "Hold him, Turner!" the detective shouted over his shoulder, disappearing into the bedroom. A heavy hand clamped onto Homan's upper arm as he made towards the bedroom. "You don't understand," Homan said angrily. "We've got to get her to our hospital immediately." He wrenched his arm free and ran into the bedroom. He saw the detective sitting on the bed, untying Casey's hands. No, wait! Don't release her! She's insane! You don't understand!" he managed to gasp as the uniformed man caught him again. "Oh, we understand, all right," said the CID man, turning to eye him coolly. "Your colleagues told us you hadn't been well. Now, don't give us any trouble, mate. I'm just in the mood for a bastard like you." He spoke quietly, but the menace was unmistakable. Homan realized there was nothing he could do for the moment. All right, let's take it easy. But you've got to get her to a hospital," he said, trying to keep calm. "I was in the earthquake in Wiltshire last week. There was a gas released. It affects the brain." "It certainly affected yours," said the detective, helping the girl to her feet. "I don't know what you've done to her, but look at her. Look at those eyes." No, it wasn't me. It was the fog. Spires was caught up in it too. It affects the brain. As far as we know, there have been no reports of gas doing any damage at the earthquake." "But I was inside it, inside the eruption where the gas was." "Yes, we heard about a man and a child being rescued. The kid's dead. We'll take your word for it that you were the man. But there's been no mention of anybody else being down there." "They weren't down there." Homan fought hard to control his temper. "This was later, at different times." "All right, Sergeant, let's get him out of here. We've got plenty of time for questions." "Wait a minute. There's something else." Homan resisted the strong arms of the policeman holding him. "There was a busload of kids caught in the fog. It was a school in Andover. You've got to find it, and quickly. God knows what's happened there by now." Homan impatiently drummed his fingers on the bare table in one of New Scotland Yard's many interview rooms. He'd been at the police headquarters for well over 3 hours now, wearily answering the same questions over and over again. Their disbelief was evident, and he realized that he couldn't blame them. He had been the only other person in the office when Spires had jumped, and they had been heard arguing beforehand. The police had discovered him with a bound and beaten girl in his flat. He'd only just been released from hospital after suffering a mental breakdown. The facts spoke for themselves. They had finally agreed to check on the schools in Andover. If there was some abnormality with the pupils, then maybe his story could begin to take on some credence. He looked up sharply as the door opened and 2 men walked in briskly. One was the detective who brought him in, and the other, an older, sterner-looking man, was Chief Superintendent Reeford. Reeford had tried to determine whether Homan was a dangerous lunatic or a clever liar, and so far he wasn't sure. "We've been checking on the schools in Andover and found nothing." Homan's look of frustration was too natural to be forced. "However," the chief superintendent went on, "we've had a report of a serious fire in a school on the outskirts of the town. Apparently the fire was in a gymnasium adjoining the school, and there could have been 30 or so boys trapped inside. The survivors can't be questioned just yet. The name of the school was Creighton's." Homan frowned as he tried to remember. No, I don't think that was it. I do remember the teacher only had 1 arm, but that's not much use to you. The chief superintendent studied Homan's face for a few moments and then said, "All right, that was not the real name. The name is Redbrook House. Ring a bell?" "It sounds right," Holman said doubtfully. "All right, Mr. Holman," said the policeman. "We'll have to hold you a short time while we're making further investigations." "But what about Casey? She'll need me." "Miss Simmons will be well looked after." "Where is she?" "At the moment she's in the Middlesex Hospital under sedation. It seems she's still in a state of shock." "But don't you see that's because of the fog? It's a reaction to it." "Whether it is or not, we'll soon find out. And tell me something, Mr. Holman. If this fog is drifting around the country sending people mad, why haven't we had reports of it? Why aren't all the people living in that part of the country raving lunatics?" A slight edge of anger had appeared in the policeman's last question. There was an abrupt silence in the small room. Two pairs of eyes looked intently into Holman's, the two policemen waiting for his reply. "Look," he said wearily, "I just don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. Maybe the Ministry of Defense can tell you. They've got military installations down on Salisbury Plain. They conduct experiments, dangerous experiments, in the interests of the nation. Maybe they've got some answers." "Are you saying that the Ministry of Defense is responsible for this? That they release some sort of—" Reeford paused. "Some sort of nerve gas? Oh, for God's sake, I don't know. It's a possibility, though." "If what you say is true, Mr. Holman, then we should know very shortly. And until we do, I'm afraid we have to hold you." "Oh, okay, but see that they look after Casey. She's got to be watched constantly." "She'll be in safe hands, Mr. Holman. I can assure you of that." Chapter 8. Herbert Brown was worried about his pigeons. He drained his whiskey and stared at the empty glass for a moment. "I should have been back before now," he said mournfully to the barman. "I only took 'em down to Salisbury in the van. Got some new ones, you see. Mustn't take 'em too far, or they'll never find their way home. Some of the older ones are with 'em, so they should have been all right. And Claude never gets lost." Harry the barman had to hide a grin as he thought of the ridiculously named pigeon, which was Herbert's favourite. He'd had it for many years, a scruffy old bird that always looked as though it had just escaped from the clutches of a cat. "Took 'em on Sunday," Herbert continued, his words slurring slightly. "She'll be back by now. Trouble is, you see, you need the sun to guide them." Herbert stood up, swaying slightly. "I'm off, Harry." He weaved his way out. Once outside, he leaned against the wall for a minute or two. He'd taken that last drink too fast. It was the thought that his beloved birds might be waiting for him that had suddenly caused his haste. Herbert went across the road to his little fruit shop, opened the side door, then felt his way down the steps to the backyard, not bothering to turn on the lights. Unbolting the heavy back door, he stepped outside and listened. He heard the sound of cooing and looked up towards the roof. His pigeons, they'd come back, bless them. He went back inside and up to the landing window. He scrambled through it onto the flat roof. Now the cooing was louder, and he could hear the sounds of movement inside the coop as the birds shuffled on their perches. He struggled with the latch on the door, then switched on the bicycle lamp hanging up inside the hut. The sudden light caused several of the birds to flutter around in panic. "It's all right, darling. It's only me. I won't hurt you." Herbert closed the door behind him so that none of the pigeons could escape. He had to crouch low, for the sloping roof of the hut was not high enough to allow him to stand. He quickly checked over the birds, and finally spotted Claude, perched high in the corner of the hut, not moving, but a gentle cooing coming from its throat. "Hello, old Claude. What have you got to say to yourself, eh?" He gently picked up the pigeon. The bird's beak shot forward and pecked at Herbert's bleary eye. He screamed out and fell back among the perches. The whole hut erupted into a whirlwind of screeching, fluttering bodies as the birds flew at him from all sides. He raised his arms to protect his face, but they pecked at his hands viciously, causing thin trickles of blood to run down them. The shock forced him to his feet, thrashing out violently, smashing the birds to the ground, crushing them with his feet as he staggered blindly towards the small doorway. But in the turmoil, in the confusion of flying bodies, he had lost all sense of direction and crashed into the side of the hut, knocking himself to the ground. As he lay there, arms outstretched, stunned by the fall, the pigeons flurried onto his heaving chest and continued their combined onslaught. He screamed aloud, shaking, shuddering, his entire body flailing his limbs, and lumbered towards the small exit, still covered in feathered, tormenting bodies. Unable to see the torch, he sent it flying as he stumbled through the door, his brain, as well as his eyes, blind now. Moments later, he fell from the flat roof, his body hitting the concrete below with a squelching thud. Above him, on the roof of the coop, the pigeons had gathered. They gazed down at him, and were still. The one called Claude cooed softly. Much earlier on that same day, Edward Smallwood had been fishing. He was a tall, nervous man, prematurely balding, and at the age of 35 still living with his parents. Both parents loved their gangling, stoop-shouldered boy in different ways, and they had guided him into his first and only job at the age of 16, a job in the bank, where he had stayed and worked his way up to the position of assistant manager. He had not even felt disappointed when the manager had died 2 years before, and he had not been offered the appointment. Edward had never really hated anyone before that, but Norman Symes, the new bank manager, had aroused passions in him that had never even been tickled before. Symes' philosophy in life seemed to be, if each day I can bring a little unhappiness into the life of Edward Smallwood, then that day has not been in vain. Edward was well aware of how others on the staff enjoyed his discomfort in the presence of the manager, and so was Symes. That was half the trouble. The manager seemed to go out of his way to humiliate him in front of the others. Edward pushed back the bedclothes and groped for his glasses on the small bedside table. His day had already been ruined by the fog which had suddenly descended upon him while he was fishing on a remote bank of the River Avon at 6 o'clock that morning. Twice a week he cycled out to his favourite spot to fish, and had found great pleasure in the quiet solitude of the river bank. It helped him to steel himself against the oncoming day. But that particular morning, it was only when he suddenly realized he could hardly see the end of his line that he became aware of the fog surrounding him. It had taken him a good 10 minutes to find his way back to the main road. His mother was, as usual, overly sympathetic when he reached home, and packed him off to bed for an extra hour's rest before he went off to work. Now he found his glasses and rubbed his eyes before putting them on, frowning with a headache that he had just become aware of. Later, the dull throbbing in his head increased as he walked through the town towards his branch of the Midland Bank. As he stepped off the curb, the beep of a car startled Edward into reality. He jumped back, his heels catching on the curb, and sat down heavily on the pavement, managing to cling to his briefcase. He heard the sniggers of passers-by as he sat there, his knees together, ankles far stretched, holding his briefcase in his lap. He stood up, brushing at the back of his trousers with his hand, a huge blush sweeping over his face to the top of his balding scalp. "Damn them," he cursed inwardly, years of bitter resentment welling up inside him. Damn them for laughing. Damn the whole town. Damn the Midland Bank. Damn Symes. He saw a man ahead of him stoop to pat the upturned head of a friend's dog. Edward strode briskly up to him and gave the offered bottom a hearty kick. The man jumped up with an astonished yelp, the dog holding on to his hand with its teeth in fright. Edward marched on, ignoring the confused barking and shouting he'd left behind. A trader came out of his shop to see what the disturbance was about, and as Edward passed him, he whirled and dealt the inquisitive shopkeeper a swift kick to his seat. The man turned, using both hands to rub his smarting bottom, and stared after the retreating assistant bank manager, not quite sure what had happened. Edward made his way along the street, kicking bottoms at random. He rounded a corner and spotted the most enormous backside he'd ever seen trundling along ahead of him. It belonged to the proprietor of one of the costlier hotels in Ringwood, a pompous man and a perfectionist in his trade. The sharp blow to his rear startled him, and he turned quickly to discover the source of his rude surprise, and to his amazement found a tall, bespectacled man glaring challengingly into his face. The hotel proprietor half turned to trundle away, frightened by the gleam in the advancing Edward's eye. "Get away!" he spluttered, his fat legs increasing their pace, finally breaking into a lumbering run. Edward followed, dealing out more kicks to the large, wobbling target before him. They left a trail of bewildered onlookers behind them, who stared and then chuckled at one another in delight. Finally, the hotel proprietor saw a policeman emerging from a shop. Fortunately for Edward, he'd seen the policeman too, and had slowed down to a casual stroll. The fat man grabbed the policeman by the arm and was stabbing an agitated finger towards the now passing assistant bank manager. That man has been chasing me." The policeman calmly turned and looked down at the fat man tugging at his shirt sleeve, and then at the passer-by he was gesticulating towards. Just a moment, sir," he called to Edward. "Yes, officer?" Edward walked calmly over to the two men, a faint look of surprise on his face. This man says you assaulted him, sir," the policeman said, almost apologetically. "I beg your pardon," Edward replied, slightly indignant, not ruffled, but as though curious about the insinuation. "He says you attacked him, sir." "Officer, there must be some mistake," said Edward. "I've never seen this man before." The policeman tried to calm the fat man, who was hopping up and down behind him. "He's kicked my bottom black and blue. Do something, constable." "Kicked it? Oh, really, officer?" Edward smiled benignly. "I do have to be on my way, or I'll be late for work. But, of course, if I can assist you in any way—" Just a moment, sir." The policeman turned to face the dismayed hotel proprietor. "Have you any witnesses?" "Well, of course I have. Yes, yes." The fat man pointed at the onlookers. Unfortunately, they only chuckled and shook their heads at the policeman. "I see," the policeman said, putting away his notebook, a weary look on his face. "But he did kick me!" wailed the fat man. "I did not," said Edward calmly. "Well, I'm afraid, sir, there's nothing I can do unless you have witnesses," said the policeman. "Now, why don't you go on about your business and let this gentleman go on about his?" He ignored the outraged spluttering of the proprietor and turned back to Edward, speaking in a confidential tone. "I'm sorry about this, sir. It often happens with these people. They see uniform and immediately use it to make themselves feel important. He's harmless enough." "Oh, I quite understand, officer," said Edward with concern. "It's quite all right, really. They want to be noticed, that's all." The policeman smiled. "Certainly original, though, sir, saying you kicked his bottom all the way down the street." As the policeman turned and walked towards his car, Edward took 2 brisk steps after him, swung his foot back, and gave him a hefty kick in the seat of the pants. Symes looked up at the clock on the wall for the 4th time that morning, 10:30, and still Smallwood had not shown. The scowling bank manager expected the telephone to ring at any moment, and Smallwood's distraught mother to pour out excuses about the condition of her son's ill health as soon as he picked up the receiver. There was a light tap on the door, and his secretary poked her head through and said, "Mr. Smallwood's in, Mr. Symes. I thought you might like to know." She smiled smugly. Symes looked up in surprise. It was usual for his assistant to be away, but very unusual for him to be late. "Is he indeed? Well, I'd like to see him right away, Mrs. Platt." Seconds later the door opened to reveal Smallwood standing outside. Come in, don't just stand there," said Symes irritably. "Why are you so late?" Edward rubbed his forehead and said, "I ran into a little trouble, sir." The little trouble had, in fact, amounted to being charged with a breach of the peace, a charge he would have to answer to in court next day. A kindly police sergeant who knew his parents had advised him to go and rest, knowing there was nothing malicious about him, but Edward hadn't gone home. He had something to do. Symes studied his assistant's face and sighed resignedly. "All right, tell me later. Now, I've got an appointment at 11, and I want to go down to the vault before I leave. The Reverend Dr. Peters brought in a large deposit for his restoration fund, and I don't want it lying around all day. I may not be back at all today." He picked up the vault keys, then a large envelope, and walked towards the door. "Oh, come along, man, I haven't got all day," he said to Edward impatiently. They descended the steps to the basement room that contained the vault, and Symes unlocked the heavy metal door. The vault itself stood at one end, fairly small, but large enough for a bank of this size. The bank manager walked towards it, and Edward followed. Symes swung the heavy metal door open and placed one foot inside the vault, reaching for a small black box marked the Reverend Dr. Anthony Peters. Edward stepped forward and pushed his employer's back violently. Symes fell forward, and the heavy door swung shut, leaving him in a frightening black void. Edward leaned his aching forehead against the cold metal. The air inside the vault would not last long, certainly for not more than a night. He walked from the room, locking the door behind him, and climbed the stairs to the ground floor. "Where's Mr. Symes?" asked Mrs. Platt as he passed. "Oh, he's gone out for the day," answered Edward. "He went out the back way to his car, said he was late." She went back to her typing. Then, "Mrs. Platt," said Edward. She looked up at him. "I'm going home now. I don't feel well." He walked away from her. "I doubt if I'll be back." Chapter 9. "It seems we may owe you an apology, Mr. Holman," said Reeford, looking across at Holman. "You mean you've had more news from the school?" "Indeed we have," said Chief Inspector Reeford. Holman sighed. Barrow had brought him up to Reeford's office without saying a word. Both CID men had spent much of the night talking with various police stations around the Salisbury area in an effort to find out if any unusual incidents had occurred in their areas recently and if anyone had reported fog. The report from Andover concerning Red Brook House had spurred them into this activity. "Well, tell me what's happened," said Holman. "From a class of 37, one boy managed to escape without any serious injury from the fire. Some of the bodies were naked, and some of them had been mutilated," went on Reeford. "The boy says it started out as a normal PE lesson, and then the boys turned on their sports master and beat him unconscious. Then the other teacher, Summers, came in and they attacked him. Apparently, all the boys seem to have gone completely berserk, beating and—" he paused, "and mutilating each other." "Is this boy insane?" asked Holman. "The doctors are sure he is not mad, and so are we." "Why? What makes you think so?" "Something that helps to confirm your story about the fog." Barrow spoke. "He was ill on the day of the outing and didn't go. He sat at the back of the gymnasium, and luckily they took no notice of him." Holman asked, "What happens now?" "We are trying to trace the whereabouts of the fog and asking if any strange things have been happening. There was a hatchet murder a few days ago. A man named Abbott chopped up a wealthy landowner, his wife and his 2 women staff, and then he cut his own wrists. And in the same area a farmer was trampled to death by his cattle, and a vicar ran amok in his church. We've asked for any further reports to be sent directly to us, and we are now trying to locate the fog. So what's your next move?" "We compile all the facts, and then I contact the Commissioner with a view to presenting the evidence to the Home Secretary." "But the people should be cleared from the path of the fog," said Holman, dismayed. Well, first we have to find the fog, Mr. Homan, and then we have to make sure it's responsible for these outbreaks. Homan sprang to his feet. We can't sit around doing nothing, he shouted. I've told you my course of action, snapped Reeford. Now please sit down and try to be a little bit more patient. I don't have much choice, do I? Said Homan. Very well. But now I want to go to the hospital to see Casey. Reeford smiled kindly. I need you here, sir. Let me get Detective Inspector Barrow to ring the hospital and see how she is. The young detective disappeared from the room at a nod from Reeford. Barrow returned a few moments later, a look of concern on his face. The hospital says that Miss Simmons was discharged a few hours ago in the care of her father. Apparently there was nothing they could do. Unfortunately, they could not prevent her from leaving because she seemed all right. The blue-green rover sped through the quiet streets towards Highgate, its 3 occupants grim and silent. Homan stared blankly out of a window, an empty, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. Was Casey all right? Had the effects of the gas worn off? They turned left towards Hampstead, Homan peering through the window, anxiously looking for the house Casey and her father lived in. He tapped the driver's shoulder. Oh, that's it, he pointed. It was a large house, set close to the road, with a huge landscaped garden to the rear. Casey's father was a wealthy man, with interests in many commercial enterprises. On the few occasions they had met, they had taken a dislike to one another, because both knew they were vying for the same person, Casey. Now, as Homan stared up at the dark windows of the house, he cursed the older man's stupidity in insisting Casey be released from the hospital so soon, if she had harmed herself. He pushed the unwelcome thoughts from his mind and got out of the car, followed by Barrow. Chapter 10. At that precise moment, just over 100 miles away, Mavis Evers stood barefoot on Bournemouth Beach and contemplated suicide. She had driven through the night from London, fighting the tears that welled up, obscuring her vision, threatening to send her red Mini crashing off the road. Ronnie had destroyed her. Ronnie had made her fall in love. Ronnie had made her lose her innocence. Why had her lover done this to her? After living together for 2 years, Ronnie had suddenly drifted away. Ronnie had fallen in love with someone else. A man. She had fallen in love with a man. The irony was that it had been Ronnie who had seduced Mavis, introducing her to a kind of love she had never known, a private kind of love, the kind that can only be shared by 2 women. A love not acceptable to most, but more binding to those it touched because of its illicitness. Mavis had known Ronnie years before, when they were both children living in Basingstoke. They'd seen little of one another in the subsequent years, Ronnie's parents having moved to London. Later, Ronnie had moved into a flat nearer to her job. They had always corresponded fitfully, and when, not long after her 21st birthday, Mavis decided London might be the place for her too, she contacted Ronnie. Her friend wrote back, suggesting she stayed with her, at least for a while. She was still basically the same sweet friend Mavis had known all those years ago, and they got on well. "I've missed having a friend," Ronnie said one day. "But I thought you had lots of friends here." Mavis's voice was hesitant. "Oh, yes, I've lots of friends, but not a real friend like you," Ronnie replied. Mavis looked down. "I'm sorry." "Oh, don't be." Ronnie smiled. "You're here now." Her hand rested on Mavis's shoulder and then began to travel down until it found the soft mound she was looking for. Mavis shivered as the palm closed over her breast. For 2 years since that night, Ronnie and Mavis had been happy, living as lovers. Both regarded their intimacy as pure. But then, only 2 weeks ago, a change had come over Ronnie. It was rapid and alarming. Several nights she stayed out. Then last night, after being away for 3 days, she'd come back to the flat and brokenly told her friend that she'd fallen in love with a man, and had allowed that man to make love to her. Mavis had crawled towards her, weeping, and tried to put her arms around her, but Ronnie had jumped up, knocking Mavis to the floor, screaming that she must never touch her again. That was when Mavis knew she had lost. Ronnie had walked to the door and left. Mavis remained in a heap on the floor, weeping bitter tears for quite a long time. Then she decided what she would do. Fighting back her tears, she went down to the little red Minnie they had bought between them and drove through the night to Bournemouth. And now Mavis walked towards the sea, leaving her shoes on the beach behind. The water chilled her with its coldness, but the chill in her spirit was greater. She found it difficult to breathe because of the combination of cold and the fear she had begun to feel. Death. Death was so absolute, and the black sea around her was so frightening. She struggled to turn around, no longer wanting to die. She reached a point where the lapping water was only waist-deep and stopped to regain her breath. As her chest heaved, her eyes widened uncomprehendingly. There were hundreds, could it be thousands, of people climbing down the steps to the beach and walking towards her, towards the sea. The inhabitants and the holiday-makers of Bournemouth came from their homes, hotels, and guest-houses in their thousands, and made for the sea. The fog that had ruined their day yesterday was killing them that morning. They walked into the sea to drown like lemmings, the people behind them climbing over the dead bodies that were heaping up on the sea bed. There was no pain, no thoughts of God, nothingness. She was dead. The fog rejected the sea and moved inland again, as though searching for something. Chapter 11. Herman entered the dark house, trying to make as little noise as possible. "There's a light on upstairs," said Barrow, just behind him. "It's her father's bedroom," said Herman, mounting the stairs quietly. He slowly turned the handle of the bedroom door and gently pushed it open. Herman's worst fears were realized. Barrow pushed past him and leaned towards the man on the bed. "What's happened, sir? Where are you hurt?" Simmons' eyes looked down as though indicating at something near his stomach. Barrow yanked back the bedclothes and both men gasped. The end of a pair of scissors protruded from Simmons' stomach, and the sheets were stained with blood. "Jesus," breathed Barrow. He turned towards Herman. "I'm going to ride over an ambulance. Don't touch the scissors. Don't try and pull them out." He disappeared through the door. Herman bent his head towards Case's father as he tried to speak. "Why did she do it? I loved her. She knew that." "She wasn't responsible," Herman told him. "She came in contact with a poisonous gas that affected her mind." Simmons' brain accepted the words almost with relief. She had tried to kill him because she was ill. It hadn't been an act of hate. I brought her home," he said. "She kept putting her hands to her head as though she were in pain. They didn't want to let her go, but I knew she'd be better off with me." He was deep in his own thoughts. "After we'd gone to bed, I woke up perhaps a couple of hours later, and there she was, standing over me. I put out my arms, and she came towards me." He began to tremble uncontrollably. "Then she pulled back the bedclothes, and I saw the scissors slashing down." His voice broke as he relived the experience. A cry from downstairs interrupted them. It had sounded like a man's cry, probably Barrow's. Herman left the dying man, flew down the stairs, and pushed open the study door. Then he stopped. Barrow was on his hands and knees on the floor, blood oozing from a wound in his scalp. Casey stood above him, a wicked-looking shard of glass in her hand. She raised her arm, ready to plunge the pointed glass down into the back of Barrow's neck.
Homan ducked under her arm and slammed his elbow into her, knocking her against the wall. He knew from their previous struggle he would have to use force. He pinned her arms behind her, using all his strength. Barrow was watching them in amazement. "Christ!" he gasped. "To think that I didn't believe you!" Homan shouted at him, "Get something to tie her up with!" The policeman disappeared and returned a moment later with a length of curtain rope. The driver of the police car came through the front door as they were tying the girl's hands. "Ambulance is on its way, sir," he said to Barrow, not raising an eyebrow at the scene before him. Homan led the girl into the vast lounge, where he sat her down on a long leather settee. He knelt before her, taking her pale face in his hands. She stared past him, over his shoulder, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Casey, darling, can you hear me?" he asked tenderly. Her eyes looked back at him coldly. "Bastard," she said. "She doesn't know you, Homan. Can't you see that?" said Barrow, not unkindly. "No, she doesn't." Homan's eyes clouded. "Will she ever know me again?" This time, Homan went with Casey to the hospital, and Detective Inspector Barrow went back to Chief Superintendent Reeford at New Scotland Yard. He hurried to Reeford's office, who sent him rushing back to the hospital to bring in Homan. When they got back, Reeford wasted no time. "We've little time to apologize, Mr. Homan," he began bluntly. "I've heard briefly what happened to yourself and Detective Inspector Barrow, and I sympathize, but events have taken on a greater significance. We have a meeting with the Commissioner of Police in—" he looked at his watch— "10 minutes. Reeford's face became even more grave as he went on. "Just under an hour ago, the most alarming news of all came through. At around 6 o'clock this morning, virtually the entire population of Bournemouth left their homes and walked into the sea in a mass suicide attempt." Silence filled the room. "Men, women and children, all drowned. The shores around Bournemouth are littered with corpses." Now Barrow spoke. "What about the fog, sir? Has it been sighted?" "I've issued instructions to locate it, but naturally the local towns have enough on their minds without worrying about the fog. But one thing I did learn: Bournemouth was covered in a thick blanket of fog yesterday." 20 minutes later, Homan found himself in a large oak-panelled room in Whitehall, surrounded by ministers and their chiefs of staff, having questions fired at him. The Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Army angrily rejected his insinuations that the military in Salisbury might have some answers as to the cause of the fog. The Home Secretary said sharply, "Gentlemen, we will not have arguments at this stage. James, I want a full report of all recent experiments carried out at Salisbury, particularly the Broadmeyer experiment." Homan caught the troubled look that passed between the two men. Then the Home Secretary turned to the Minister of State for Defence. "We'll need troops to clear Bournemouth and to control any panic that is bound to break out in the surrounding area. I want to know in which direction the fog is heading, and I want its path cleared of people." For the next 40 minutes, plans of action were laid down for the evacuation of people in the path of the threat, and ways of dispersing the fog were discussed. Then the Commissioner was handed a slip of paper and interrupted the proceedings. "They've located the fog," he announced somberly. "It's moving back north, towards Winchester." Chapter 12. Homan was driven to the Middlesex Hospital to pick up Casey, with Detective Inspector Barrow acting as escort. The Home Secretary had made him a valuable man. He was the one person they had so far who had recovered from the effects of the mysterious fog. He would have to be examined and his brain patterns studied to find out how he had recovered and if he were now immune. Casey was necessary too, as the nearest person suffering from the effects. Corpses would be flown up from Bournemouth by helicopter for autopsies to be performed on them in an attempt to discover exactly what damage had been done to their brain. Others, still living but insane, would be selected and flown up for further tests. But at that precise moment, John Homan and Casey Simmons were the two most important people in England. From the hospital they were taken with Barrow to the Ministry of Health building at the Elephant and Castle. Homan sat in the ambulance looking down at Casey, who was under sedation, holding her hand in both of his. He looked at his watch. 9:45. People were scurrying off to work, their days just beginning, just hearing of the devastating news from the seaside resort. Whom would you blame? The government? The Russians? The Chinese? What excuse would the government give? Pollution? But the public weren't that stupid anymore. They would suspect a chemical, a poisonous gas, mistakenly unleashed by some scientific laboratory. As Homan thought about it, the ambulance stopped and the doors opened. Casey was taken through a more private entrance to the rear of the building, and Homan and Barrow went down in a lift. A plump, middle-aged woman wearing a white coat greeted them when the door opened. "You must be Mr. Homan," she said, smiling. "I've been reading your file. Your photograph doesn't do you justice. I'm Janet Halstead, the principal medical officer." She led Homan and Barrow into an office and perched on the edge of the desk. "Now, first, please tell me all that's happened to you, and leave out nothing. The smallest thing could be of the greatest importance. After that, we've an extremely busy day ahead of us here. The best medical brains are either already here or on their way. I can promise you we've wasted no time in the past couple of hours. And let me tell you briefly who will examine you. Most of them are from these units: cellular disorders, infectious and immune diseases, psychiatry and nervous disorders, biochemical parasitology, neurobiological studies, brain metabolism, cell mutation, molecular genetics, immunochemistry and cellular immunology, molecular pharmacology, neurological prostheses, and neuropsychiatry." She smiled at Homan. "Two others: environmental radiation, and I believe the Ministry of Defense is sending us some of their chemical defense and microbiological researchers." Homan was silent for a moment, a troubled look on his face, and then he spoke. "Two units stuck in my mind. One, I think you've tried to hide among the others. The obvious one was environmental radiation. The other was cell mutation." She looked at him keenly. "Yes, I did bury it among the others. I didn't want to alarm you. As I said, many of these divisions of investigation will be a waste of time. I think cell mutation will be one of these, but we have to be sure. As for environmental radiation, well, that's an obvious one, isn't it?" "But what exactly can you find out from me?" "First of all, information. By examining you, we can find to what extent your brain was damaged, if it was your brain." "And what about Casey?" "Oh, Miss Simmons? We'll try to cure her." Janet Halstead reached behind her and switched on a tape recorder. "Now," she said, "take your time and tell us everything you know about this mysterious fog, starting at the beginning." The rest of the day was just a blur to Homan. He was probed, tested, examined, interrogated, and by late afternoon he was allowed to fall into an exhausted sleep. He awoke after several hours to find Barrow sitting in a chair by his bedside. "You were out for the count," said Barrow. "Well, tell me what's been happening while I've been asleep," said Homan. "Quite a lot. A couple of hours ago the doctors had a go at those blokes from Porton Down, the microbiological research scientists. They were refusing to answer any more questions until they'd seen their minister." "It all seems to point in the same direction, doesn't it?" Homan commented. "How's Casey?" he went on. "I don't know, but I'll get the medical officer. She'll tell you." He gave instructions to a uniformed policeman outside the room to find Janet Halstead. "What's happened with the fog?" asked Homan as they waited. "They found it. You knew that. And it's drifting along slowly, about a mile wide and a mile high. It's growing, it's becoming thicker." "And how has the public reacted?" "As you would expect. Panic. Fear. Accusations." "And what reason has been given?" "Officially, a poisonous gas drifted in from the sea and caused the disaster in Bournemouth." "My God, are people falling for it? What about the eruption?" "No connection. Officially." "School? What about the school?" "It's been called an accidental fire. In two major disasters concerning the lives of thousands, the school incident has been easily swallowed up." There was silence for several moments. Does the public know about the fog? Yes, they had to be informed anyway to get them to move out its path. The door opened and Janet Halstead entered. Hello, how are you feeling? Her smile was a little more strange than it had been that morning. Oh, I'm fine. Tell me about Casey. Her condition is deteriorating, but there is a chance. He looked up at her hopefully. We are pretty sure we know what is happening. We all feel, that is, the members of the Medical Research Council, that the chemical and microbiological researchers from the Ministry of Defense are holding out on us. In their tests, they seemed to know exactly what it was they were looking for, as though they were looking for confirmation of an answer that they already had. We let them finish, and then we confronted them. But they clammed up and went off to see their minister. The bastards, they're covering up. Homan leapt from the bed. Barrow, you get me Sir Trevor Chambers at the Department of the Environment. If he doesn't get some answers, I'm going to blow this thing sky high. Okay, but keep calm. Yes, said Janet Halstead. It's no good getting excited. And while Inspector Barrow gets in touch with Sir Trevor, I can put you in the picture as to our findings today. Chapter 13. 2 hours later, Homan found himself at the Ministry of Defense, sitting between Janet Halstead and Sir Trevor Chambers, who had made suitable bellowing noises in the right ears. As he waited for the meeting to begin, Homan looked down the length of the long oak table. He recognized some of the faces and had been introduced to others. He tried to remember the names and titles while he waited. The Home Secretary, Charles Lyell Smith, looking calm and unruffled as always. The Minister of State for Defense, Lord Gibbon, and his principal private secretary, deep in conversation with the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Defense for the Army, William Douglas Glynn, and his principal private secretary. The big, bluff Chief of Defense Staff, Sir Hugh Dowling, talking across the table at the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Keith Macklin. The Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Hermann Riker, silently studying a document in front of him, underlining certain points with a pencil. The Home Secretary rapped on the table. Gentlemen, he began, and lady. He smiled briefly at Janet Halstead. You all know the facts. We are here to discuss a plan of action. The Prime Minister's instructions are that there is to be no cover-up between ourselves. We are here to find solutions so that we can combine our various skills to combat this growing, and I mean that literally, threat. He looked across the table, allowing his words to take their effect. Then he turned to the Minister of State for Defense, seated on his left, and said, Richard, will you start? Lord Gibbon leaned forward. Yes. Well, 15 years ago, our microbiological research establishment at Porton Down had a brilliant scientist named Broadmeyer. His speciality was bacteriological warfare. He took mycoplasma and mutated it, producing an organism that could affect the brains of men or animals. Lord Gibbon turned to the Chief Scientific Advisor. Would you go on, Professor Riker? Riker looked around at the assembly. Broadmeyer was a little irresponsible. He mutated the mycoplasma so that if it entered the bloodstream, it would attack the healthy existing cells and travel as a parasite to the brain. The microorganisms caused inflammation of the brain and led to a build-up of new parasitical cells. The stronger the parasites become, the more easily the healthy cells are devoured, hence the complete mental breakdown of whoever contracts the disease. Eventually, the victim will become a vegetable, capable of no action at all. But what about me? Homan exclaimed. Why didn't I become a vegetable? The principal medical officer spoke up. Mr. Homan was given a blood transfusion because of an injury he sustained during his attack. I assume this helped to clear the bloodstream of the foreign cells. Precisely, Mrs. Halstead, the professor nodded. Luckily for Mr. Holman, he has seen the transfusion before the parasitical cells had a chance to multiply. But he was also lucky in another respect. Like most organisms used in germ warfare, the Broad-Meyer mutation was self-reproducing. All it needed was carbon dioxide to grow and grow. Mr. Holman was exposed to it when it had just been released in its pure form, therefore it was comparatively weak. The fog is a byproduct of the process it goes through as it draws the carbon dioxide from the air. This in itself is strange, for normally an organism that lives on carbon dioxide would require sunlight to live and multiply. So you see the contradiction. They should need sunlight to exist, and yet they surround themselves with this strange mist. Only Broad-Meyer, as the creator of this mutation, knew the answer, and unfortunately he is dead, killed by the disease that he made. The mutation was contained and was considered too dangerous to use. Perhaps Lieutenant General Macklin would care to tell you what happened to it. He raised his eyebrows towards the Vice Chief of the General Staff. First, Janet Halstead broke in hastily, may I ask Professor Riker about the cure? The Home Secretary nodded. You confirm that blood transfusion is the answer, then, Professor? She asked Riker. Oh, yes, provided it is given in time. If the parasite cells have taken on too strong a hold in the brain, then new blood will be of no use at all. But what if we use radiology to burn out the bad cells? Yes, it's a possibility. But remember, nothing can ever be done about healthy cells that have been damaged, either by the parasites or the X-ray. They will never grow again. No, but it is a chance worth taking, said Mrs. Halstead. She turned to Homan. I'm going to give Miss Simmons a blood transfusion, and if necessary, subject her to radiology. She looked round the table and rose. Excuse me, gentlemen, I have some lives to save. I trust you will keep me informed. Professor Riker suppressed an admiring grin as she marched from the room. The Home Secretary cleared his throat. Is this disease infectious? Could Mr. Homan pass it on to others? Well, that does not appear to have happened, does it? Riker answered. Our problem is that we do not know enough about mycoplasma in its normal state, let alone when it has been tampered with. Mycoplasmas are similar to bacteria with one important exception. They lack a cell wall. Riker's next words cut through the incomprehension like a knife. This means they are completely resistant to penicillin and any other substances which act by disrupting the synthesis of bacterial cell walls. You mean there is no cure? Asked the Trevor. Oh, no, we will find one, Riker assured them all. But we need to know exactly how the mycoplasma has been mutated. If you had some of the mutated mycoplasma in its pure state, then it would be an enormous advantage. This is leading to our next point, gentlemen, said the Home Secretary. I'd like to get back to Lieutenant General Macklin. Sir Keith, how did the virus escape? Sir Keith Macklin rose to his feet as though to address the officers on his staff. The Broad-Meyer mycoplasma, he began, was contained in a sealed-off room in small glass steel containers. Broad-Meyer noticed a dislodged cap, replaced it, and left the sealed room. It took a while for him to become insane. When he did, he went under very fast. He destroyed his work and killed a fellow scientist, and then killed himself. We decided the mutation was too dangerous ever to be used. We couldn't destroy it. We didn't know what it was exactly, and we couldn't dump it in the sea. We considered that was too risky. So we buried it, 2 miles below ground, in glassed steel vials inside a strong lead container. Sir Keith paused, then went on. Records were made concerning the mycoplasma's potential and its location, and filed away. 15 years ago, as I said. Then a few weeks ago, we were experimenting with a powerful new explosive, and it caused a running fissure below the Earth. It was this that caused the eruption and released the mycoplasma. Do you mean to tell me you have a bomb that can cause that sort of damage 2 miles down? Asked Sir Trevor incredulously. Yes, answered Sir Keith. The fissure that caused most damage was several miles deep. We assume it was the mutation, already polluted and creating its own gas, that was seen emerging from the fissure. The Home Secretary spoke before anyone else had a chance to. Thank you, Sir Keith. The Vice Chief of the General Staff sat down, and the Home Secretary continued. Gentlemen, we know most of the facts now, and let me stress that human error of this magnitude will not be tolerated. I can assure you, he looked at Sir Trevor, it will be looked into thoroughly after we have defeated the present threat. Now, let us get on with it. We have lost the battle to prevent the fog entering Winchester. Fortunately, all the residents have been evacuated in time. Perhaps you will tell us what's been happening, William. The Home Secretary turned to the Under Secretary of State for Defense for the Army, William Douglas Glynn. We're looking at various possibilities, said Douglas Glynn, but we haven't been able to get rid of the fog because it goes on manufacturing itself. We've tried all the ways known to us, so if we cannot disperse the fog, our only hope is to find the antidote to the disease, fast. And to make that serum, we need some of the mutated mycoplasma itself, as Professor Riker says, in its purest form. Sir Trevor Chambers looked across at the scientist. Couldn't someone wearing protective clothing get close enough to get a sample? It's not a matter of getting close enough, said Riker. It means going to the very center or nucleus of the mycoplasma itself. Sir Trevor broke in huffily. All right, so the neat stuff is in the center. That still doesn't prevent someone with suitable protection going in to get it. There is no practical protection from it, said Riker. Lead-lined suits, said Herman. The wearer would have to travel half a mile to reach the fog center in virtual darkness, and still have no guarantee he would be safe from mutated mycoplasma at its strongest. The Home Secretary sat back in his chair. What we need is someone who is immune to the disease to go in and bring back a sample. You, Mr. Herman, it would seem, are the only possibility. Chapter 14. No one could force Herman to enter the fog again, but what else could he do? If they couldn't destroy the fog, then millions could die from it. The only answer was the serum, and he was the only suitable person available. Now, as he walked through the yellow mist, he thought of Casey. The transfusion on Casey had been successful. This morning, it would be the turn of radiation to burn out the badness, and he prayed that it would work. He dreaded the moment he would have to tell her that Simmons was dead. Herman would never tell Casey she had killed her own father. It might destroy her. The fog was becoming thicker, more yellow. He began to think about the street plan of Winchester. Now, let's see, he thought. This must be the shopping arcade. Now, if I turn right, it could lead me to the cathedral. They told him the source of energy seemed to be coming from somewhere near the old cathedral. The trolley that trailed along behind him like a faithful dog contained a lead-lined box that operated on the same principle as a vacuum cleaner. Attached to its side were several lengths of metal tubing that, when assembled and joined to a tough, flexible hose from the container, could be probed into the nucleus of the mutated mycoplasma and a sample drawn back by the holder. It was a hastily conceived plan, but the only one available to them in so short a time. Summoning up his courage, Herman turned into the street leading to the cathedral, and as he approached the cathedral's entrance, he noticed a faint, half-glow. He stopped dead. Was it possible? Was the nucleus the heart of the disease, housed within Winchester Cathedral? Another, more disturbing thought jarred Herman's mind. What if it hadn't drifted in by accident? Could it possibly be self-motivated? The thought persisted as he walked on into the great church. Herman looked towards the source of the glow. It was at its strongest at the center of the cathedral's vast interior, near the altar. Homan knelt down by the machine at his side. He remembered his oxygen mask and drew in several deep breaths. His head immediately became clearer. He still wasn't sure if he had the courage to approach the glowing mass, the mass that looked pure but was in fact made from the deadly growing mutation, so he closed his mind to it. He concentrated on putting the rods together. Suddenly, he heard a footstep behind, and someone put his arms around Homan's neck, squeezing his throat, trying to choke him to death. Homan felt as though his head was about to explode. His consciousness slipped away from him, and a deep-throated chuckle was the last sound he heard before he blacked out. Later, the fog began to clear from the town. Helicopters hovering around the fringes of the thick blanket swooped down to search for Homan, and found the lunatic trying to bury him alive. They landed to find Homan at the bottom of the open grave where he'd been roughly dumped. He opened his eyes to see a face above him. It grinned, and its voice said, "This is no time to lie down on the job, Mr. Homan." A hand was extended to help him climb from his gruesome resting place. Chapter 15. Homan was filled with apprehension as he walked towards Observation Room 3, in which Casey was now resting. He had been told the radiology treatment had gone well, and now they were waiting for Casey to come out of a deep slumber before they could tell if it had been successful. Homan needed sleep too. His experience that morning had left him drained. Riker had naturally been disappointed when he had returned without a sample of the mutated mycoplasma, but did not persist in urging Homan to try again. The unpredicted change of weather was moving the fog too rapidly anyway for him to be able to locate its center. Towns that lay directly in its path were being evacuated, but fortunately the direction in which it was moving was not too densely populated. They prayed that the wind would not change its easterly direction and carry the fog towards Basingstoke, Farnham, Aldershot, London. The proposal to build huge fires in London to disperse the fog if it entered the city was considered, but it was to be a last resort. The public had been told an antidote was being prepared, and large quantities would soon be available. They had been told the disease itself was weakening and would probably soon die. They had been lied to, because the government thought it best. Large-scale panic would only increase the danger to lives. Homan had discussed with Riker the fact that the mutated mycoplasma had been trapped inside the cathedral. Could it have, Homan had hesitated to say it, could it have intelligence? After all, it was a parasite that fed on the brain. Professor Riker had laughed, but without humor. Every living thing has some intelligence. It's a matter of degree. But to suggest this organism has a mind of its own? No, Mr. Holman. Don't let your harrowing experience this morning send you into the realms of fantasy. It is a mindless, organic thing, incapable of action by thought. Barrow had accompanied Homan to the research center after Homan had given his report to the Home Secretary in person, promising he would attempt to procure some of the mycoplasma as soon as conditions were favorable. When that moment arrived, he would be flown to the spot immediately. The rising trepidation Homan felt reached its peak when he sat down in the chair beside Casey's bed. He sat watching Casey's face for several minutes. Then he touched her lips with his hand and spoke her name. For an instant her eyelids flickered, and then they opened. He froze, and for that tiny second nothing existed. Then the eyes became a person's, because emotion was filtering through them, and they smiled, and her lips smiled with them. "Why do you call me Casey, John?" she asked, and went back to sleep. The principal medical officer, Janet Halstead, was delighted when Homan told her of Casey's words. She found him in a quiet room and left him resting while she went back to study Casey's chart. 3 hours later, Barrow woke him. "She's awake, Homan, and she's fine," he told him. "Any new developments with the fog?" Homan asked as he slipped on his jacket. "Plenty, but I'll tell you later." Casey's face lit up as Homan walked through the door, and in a second they were in each other's arms. "You're all right," Holman laughed, breaking away from the tight embrace at last. He hesitated. Do you remember anything? I remember trying to kill you, she said, looking away. He drew her towards him and said nothing. My father's dead, isn't he? Holman was stunned. She remembered that. Finally he said, Yes, Casey, he's dead. She cried out then, I loved him so much. How can I ever live with what I've done? It wasn't your fault, Casey. You weren't responsible. And you, John, I tried to kill you too. Can you forgive me? I told you, darling, you weren't responsible. Am I really all right now? Yes, of course you are. He talked to her quietly for a long time, the intensity of his words breaking through her barrier of regret. What's going to happen now? She finally asked. They want me to go back into the fog for the mycoplasma. Briefly, he told her of the disasters, of his immunity, and the fact that she would now be immune. He told her of the disease, of its origin, of the blind foolishness that had freed it. They were interrupted by Janet Halstead. We still have a few more tests to make on Miss Simmons, and then I think she should get some rest. Holman kissed Casey and promised to return as soon as he was allowed. Barrow was waiting for him in the corridor. They want you to go in again, he told Holman. All right. Since I have no choice, I'll choose to try again. A helicopter flew them to a point east of Hazelmere. They were met by Professor Riker, who said, We are going to spray the fog with calcium chloride all night to dry it up, and by early morning it should have depleted enough for us to see the actual mycoplasma. In the meantime, Mr. Holman, there's nothing for you to do. I suggest you try to sleep, and we'll call you when the time is right. But morning brought a surprise. Barrow woke Holman and said, The fog's gone. It's disappeared. Chapter 16. Holman opened his eyes and then turned towards the figure lying in his bed next to him. How different she looked from the last time she had been in his flat. Would he ever forget the violence of her attack on him? Janet Halstead had assured him Casey was completely cured, as was he, and had allowed him to bring her home. But it was difficult to rid himself of all his fears. Only time would do that. Holman was on call at any time, although they had found no trace of the fog for 2 days now. The trail of havoc was appalling, for not everybody had been cleared from its path in time. For many, the effect was immediate, causing instant madness. Many people were killed. Many killed themselves. On the first day of quiet, when the fog had inexplicably disappeared, the public had started to demand answers. What was the fog? Where had it come from? Had it really gone? And if so, could it possibly return? Were there still lunatics at large? And what were the first symptoms? Today was the day of answers and reassurances. Holman's hand found the soft curve of Casey's waist, and he dreaded the telephone call that might take him away from her. The thought of going back into the fog was repugnant to him, and he prayed it had been finally vanquished. She stirred and snuggled towards him. After some time, he rolled onto his back. She turned sideways to gaze at his relaxed face. "Why do you call me Casey?" she asked suddenly. He began to chuckle. "Well, when I was a kid, I used to have a dog. A dog? And I used to call it Casey. Casey, you had the same sad little eyes, and they made me fall in love with you, and that's why I called you Casey." She fell against him, half laughing. Imagine my delight when I found you were house-trained, too. They were silent for a moment. Then she asked, "Is it over now? The fog? The nightmare?" "I just hope so. If it isn't, well, I just don't know what else they can do about it." They'd been lucky, both of them. But the price they had to pay in memories was harsh. He looked down at her, and her eyes met his. She, too, had been lost in her own thoughts. She smiled. "I'm okay," she said. "I'll get some coffee." He lay back and watched her naked figure slip into his discarded shirt. She walked round the bed and began to draw the curtains, but she stopped midway. "John," he heard her say. "Oh, God," he gasped. For there was just a grey blankness, a heavy, still blankness, tinged with yellow. After 2 days of searching, just when the army had begun to relax, the fog had appeared again, as though it had been lying in wait. It swept over the countryside, and it grew larger. It passed through the smaller towns, then through industrial estates, which belched out their filthy fumes even during the night, and it welcomed the polluted air, drawing it into its poisonous womb, growing with it. It drifted inwards, towards the city. It sent some of the army mad. The rest sped ahead of the fog, loudspeakers blaring out their ill-timed warning. But by the time the message registered, it was already too late. The growing fog had arrived. Janet Halstead listened in silence, her expression never changing. When she finally put down the telephone, she stared at it for a few seconds longer. Then she began to snap instructions for the immediate evacuation of the research center. All equipment, notes, anything useful that could be dismantled were to be moved to another location, a secret location. Transport was already on its way to take them there. Sam Reynolds, a middle-aged security guard, was checking out his favorite room at the very top of the giant oil company building that towered over the Black River Thames. It contained the largest boardroom table he'd ever seen. 60 people could be comfortably seated round it. He stepped into the room and strolled towards the huge windows that looked south across London. Tonight, there was an orange glow in the sky, and he drew in his breath as he realized the cause of it. He saw a line of fires stretching across South London, huge fires at irregular intervals, their flames red and frightening. Then the flames seemed to lose their brightness, as though they were being covered, one by one, by a semi-transparent blanket, leaving only a red glow shining dully through. The approaching fog gradually swallowed the town, piece by piece, until it reached the river just below him. And then even the river was gone, and the fog was brushing against the large plate glass window in front of him. McClellan, Homan's colleague at the Ministry of the Environment, stared from his bedroom window out at the fog. His eyes were heavy from unshed tears. He knew it was the fog. Its yellowish tinge told him that. He was much more aware of the danger than most of the general public, for he had been closer to the strange occurrences through Homan and the dead spires, and many people still did not understand that it was not the fog that killed, but the madness it caused that drove people to their deaths. He turned to look at his wife, asleep and vulnerable. As he thought of his children in the adjoining bedrooms, the tears of bitterness and frustration broke. There must be a way to protect them. Then he had the answer. It wasn't ideal, but it could give them a little time. He went into his daughter's bedroom and took the small toy blackboard from its easel, together with some chalk, and then went downstairs. He chalked a message in large capitals on the board. Opening the front door, he placed the message on the doorstep, praying that it would serve its purpose. Then he went back upstairs and found his wife's sleeping pills. He filled a glass full of water and returned to his daughter's bedroom. He forced her to take 5 of the pills. Then he repeated the same operation on the boys next door. Then he woke his wife. Joan at first refused to take the pills, but after much persuasion and then pleading, she agreed. For himself, he took 8. He climbed back into the warm bed and drew his weeping wife to him. They lay there, waiting for sleep to come.
Chief Superintendent Reeford slumped down the stairs and entered the kitchen. Yawning freely, he filled the electric kettle with water and switched it on. God, he was tired. He had worked long hours because of this wretched fog business, and last night was the first he'd been able to take off. He went to the front door to collect the milk, eager for his first lungful of fresh morning air, something he always looked forward to. As he opened the door, he was already drawing in his breath. Before he saw the fog, his lungs were half full of it. Detective Inspector Barrow slept. He'd had a heavy week, and this had been his first break. He had gratefully sunk into his bed, for once, unaccompanied by a girl. He had been too tired even for that. He had immediately gone into a deep sleep, and still slept, as the somber grey light filtered through the fog into his bedroom. Throughout London, people were waking to discover the yellow-grey fog surrounding their homes, some realizing its meaning, some not, many already too insane to care. Thousands had fled during the night, fortunate to have heard the warnings of the loudspeakers or the radio broadcasts. But it was a big city, and the thousands who had time to flee were a small proportion compared to the millions who received no warning at all. The huge beacons were lit, but the rolling fog swept right over them, rising from the heat, and then immediately descending once it was cleared. Chapter 17. Homan steered the devastation vehicle cautiously out into the fog and away from the huge underground shelter. A man called Mason, gross and misshapen because of his protective clothing, sat beside him, peering through the small, lead-reinforced window, concentrating. "It doesn't seem to be quite as thick as it was," said Homan. "Oh, it's probably settled in the London basin, and now it's spreading out a bit," Mason replied. Homan nodded. It seemed logical. London was in a saucer-shaped bowl surrounded by hills. The fog would have drifted into it and come to rest at its base, then sprawled out, filling the tunnel. Its probable way out, unless there was a strong wind, was east, along the Thames, through the flat country of Essex. "Go left along the embankment," said Mason, checking the instruments on a panel before him. "If we follow the road into the city, it'll take us towards it." Homan turned left, using the pavement as a guideline. He could just about see the opposite pavement now, something he hadn't been able to do earlier that morning as he'd made his way to the secret shelter. Even as he and Casey had been looking out of the fog, still in a state of shock and dismay, the telephone had begun its persistent, strident ringing. It had been Douglas Glynn, the Defense Undersecretary, and he had snapped out instructions not allowing Homan to argue or dissent. He was to make her. The girl was to remain where she was. For now, it was too risky for both of them to make the journey across town. If anything happened to Homan, then they would find a way to reach her. The telephone went dead as soon as Homan said he understood and would carry out the instructions. He told Casey what was happening as he quickly dressed. He told her to bolt the door behind him and then lock herself in the bedroom. Then they kissed, and without another word, he left. The nightmare took on a new dimension once he was on his way to Westminster. He heard a car pass by, followed by a cold silence. He heard a scream, a woman's scream, and laugh. Then he heard another scream on his left, a long, piercing scream that ended in a sickening thud. Something wet brushed his face, and he put his hand to it. It was blood. Someone, a man, had jumped from a window, and their body had spattered blood for some distance as it broke on the concrete. His pace quickened. The longer it took him to reach Westminster, the more people there would be out on the streets, and it would become bedlam. He had to move faster. Dare he chance a car? He would be driving virtually blind, but it might be worth it. It wouldn't be too difficult to find one, and he knew how to start one without a key. He found his way to the curb and used it as a guide. He was bound to run into a parked car soon. He passed a woman who was pushing an ordinary house broom along the gutter, tut-tutting at the piled-up dirt and cursing at the world in general. He passed a dog feeding on the carcass of another. It looked up and growled menacingly, saliva and blood drooling from its jaws, not attacking, but watching him intently until he'd been swallowed up by the fog again. Then he saw the soft light ahead of him, which grew brighter as he approached. He thought it might be a fire at first, then perhaps a shop front because of its steady glare, but as he drew nearer, he realized its source. It gave him the answer. The way to get across London fast and with far less risk. Holman emerged from the underground station in Trafalgar Square just over 1 hour later, his hands and face black with dirt, a torch still glowing in his hand. The dark journey through the tunnels had been without incident. He paused for a moment to get his bearings, then hurried on. If his sense of direction was correct, Whitehall would be ahead of him, the Strand to the left, and the Mall just off to the right. He was at the junction of all the roads. He thanked God aloud when he discovered he was in Whitehall. Finally, he found the turn-off he sought. Westminster Bridge was just ahead, and so were the religious freaks. They were seated on the ground in a wide circle, which he had unwittingly broken into. "Welcome, brother!" One of them, who had been standing in the center leading the chant, spread his arms wide in greeting, then placed 2 huge hands on Holman's shoulders, while the dirge coming from the others grew louder. The man leaned forward and whispered, "If you try to run, I'll break your back." Holman was transfixed more by the harsh words than by the hold on him. "To your knees, brother! Humble yourself so that you might be saved!" Holman tried to resist, but more hands clasped his shoulders and forced him down. The big man's voice boomed out, "I love you, brother! We love you!" He grinned at Holman, and his hands closed on Holman's neck. In a desperate move, Holman went limp so that his body dropped, then pushed forward. The momentum forced the leader to step back, thus tripping over the bowed head of one of his flock. Holman broke free of the grip around his throat, and he lashed out with his fist. With some satisfaction, he drew blood from the big man's nose. Then he turned and ran blindly away. He knew the bridge was nearby, and he prayed that the government vehicle would be there waiting for him. He kept going, trusting luck and his instinct for survival to pull him through, and then 2 bright circles lit up before him. Behind the circles, the shadowy shape of an odd-looking machine. He heard the roar of its engine, and suddenly it was coming towards him. It must be the one. It had to be. It stopped, and a small door at its side sprang open. A strange metallic voice said, "Please get in, sir. We haven't got much time." Holman clambered into the vehicle and turned to face the heavily garbed male at the wheel, who said, "I'm Mason, sir, and this vehicle. You'll find out why later. Now, let's get going." They drove slowly along the embankment, turning left into what appeared to be an underground car park. They went deeper and deeper below ground for at least 1/4 of a mile. They stopped, and Holman made to get out. "Sit tight just a moment longer, sir," said Mason. "We're being decontaminated. As a further precaution, they'll spray us as we get out." "Spray us against what?" "The whole complex is sterile. There's not a germ down here. Everyone and everything that comes in is decontaminated. You see, it's built to contain at least 300 people for anything up to 10 years. If any bug got loose in such a confined space, well, it'd spread like wildfire."
10 years? Homan looked incredulously at the hooded figure. Just what the hell is this place? This, said Mason, is a government fallout shelter. They started building it in the early 1960s, and they're still adding to it. This is where the most important VIPs would come. There's a tunnel that leads directly to the Houses of Parliament, another one that leads to the palace. He changed the subject. Time to get out now, he said. Homan was led along more corridors by a young, unexcited man who explained exactly what had happened during the night and how it was now being coped with. The Prime Minister was there, together with most of the cabinet. They'd been the first to be warned, along with the royal family, who were now safe in Scotland. The PM had decided to stay in London, in the shelter. The army was mustered just outside London, but most of the chiefs of staff were inside the shelter, helping to draw up a plan of campaign. Professor Riker was there, along with many other notable scientists, and so was Janet Halstead. They entered a large hall filled with people and with electronic equipment, brightly lit maps, television screens. They don't know, Homan thought as he looked around at the calm room. They don't know what it's like, a complete madness that would now have gripped the town. It was an unreal situation. How could minds possibly accept the fact of one of the world's largest cities gone mad? Only he could realize its full horror, because he had seen it at first hand, had even experienced it. This way, Mr. Homan. The young man's voice cut through his thoughts. This is the planning room. The minister is waiting to brief you. As he guided the devastation vehicle along the fog-bound street, Mason beside him, Homan kept a wary eye out for groups of people. These would be the most dangerous, the ones that travelled in packs, like wolves searching for lone and defenseless victims. The fog doesn't seem to be as bad now, he commented. No, it's spreading out, thinning, but it isn't moving on yet. We won't be out in it for long. Just time enough room for me to suction some of the bastard into our container, and then we'll be off. If I didn't need your eyes, I'd do it on my own, said Mason. Riker had been present at the briefing, and had assured Homan that the danger was getting worse, and that the quickest way to probe the mutation was still to obtain a large sample of it. He had every faith in Homan that this time he would succeed. Homan wished he had as much faith in himself. On his way back to the vehicle, he'd met Janet Halstead. She, too, had urged him to succeed this time. He had left her without saying a word. How could he promise to succeed? As they drove, they passed burning buildings, blazing cars, scores of people roaming the streets, insanity evident in their faces. They passed bodies that had obviously fallen or jumped from the surrounding tall buildings. They heard screams, laughter, chanting. They saw people on their knees, praying. They went down Fleet Street towards Ludgate Circus, steeling themselves against the sights, resisting the urge to stop and help people. Suddenly they found themselves surrounded by a mob of workmen at the bottom of Fleet Street. Homan and Mason heard heavy footsteps clunking overhead as some of the men scrambled up onto the roof. "Christ, it must be all the bloody printers in Fleet Street," said Mason. Then the vehicle began to rock from side to side. "They're trying to turn us over!" shouted Homan above the noise. "Drive!" Mason commanded. The car leapt forward and ploughed through the thronging mass. Homan closed his mind from thoughts of his unfortunate victims and kept his foot down. At last they were clear and travelling up the hill towards St. Paul's. Only then did Homan's hands begin to shake. Mason clasped a steadying hand on his shoulder and then reported their position back to the underground base and related some of the incidents they had run into. The voice that acknowledged their message said people were fleeing from the town in their thousands. The fog did seem to be thinning. It was thickest around the river. The voice promised to send any further information that would help them and wished them both good luck. Mason said to Homan, "It all checks. We're going the right way. It's somewhere down by the docks." They passed fewer people as they drove through the city, but when they left its grey canyons behind them, they were faced with a spectacular scene. "Jesus," said Mason slowly. "Look at 'em. A bloody street orgy." Homan turned the vehicle and went up a narrow side street, then turned into another, wider street to get them back on their original course. After 50 yards, he stopped the vehicle with a sudden jerk.
A girl of no more than 15 was backed into a doorway. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her screams echoed. Advancing on her were two men. Their intent was obvious. She crouched in the doorway, whimpering. "Oh, God," said Homan. He stabbed his foot down hard on the accelerator, and the vehicle leapt forward with a jolt. As it gathered speed, it mounted the curb and sped towards the two men, 2 wheels on the pavement, 2 wheels in the road. One man disappeared beneath the wheels, the other was tossed into the air to slam against the merciless concrete of a building. Their short screams, and the longer, more shrill scream of the girl, spun around Homan's head even when the sound had stopped. Without a word, he guided the vehicle back into the roadway to continue the journey. From time to time, Mason reported back to the underground base, coldly describing the scenes around them, the fires, the havoc, the waste of human life. Suddenly, a bus emerged from the fog like a huge red monster. Its front was spattered with bloodstains of the many victims it had struck down. It swerved towards them and struck their vehicle side-on towards the rear. They felt themselves lifted violently as the vehicle was pushed into the air and then over onto its back. The grey world became suddenly black. For the second time that morning, Janet Halstead felt dizzy with tiredness, but she had to keep going. Countless lives depended on her. She realized Professor Riker and his team of scientists, microbiologists and virologists were close to the answer, and wondered if it had really been necessary to send Homan out into the fog once again. But she supposed it was necessary. There was a chance he could save them valuable time, be it hours or days, and his life was expendable because of it. She tried to focus her attention on the report before her. The latest patient they had treated was responding immediately to the blood transfusion and the radiology. Fortunately, they had got to him in time. Others would not be so lucky. Yes, any time Homer could save was worth his life. McClellan and his family slept soundly. Outside his house, in the normally quiet Wimbledon street where he lived, his neighbors were scratching at each other's eyes, tearing at each other's throats, far gone with the madness. McClellan was lucky, for they ignored the sign he had left on his doorstep, which said, "Please help. Have given family overdose to keep from harm. Please help." They slept on. That morning, Chief Superintendent Reeford had climbed the stairs from the kitchen carrying a kettle full of boiling water. He had stood over his wife and poured the contents of the kettle into her upturned open mouth. Her snoring had always sickened him. Then, as she had screamed and screamed, he had bundled her up in the bedclothes and locked her away in the cupboard. Soon now he would let her out and show her the kitchen knife he held in his lap. Fascinating what you could do to a human face with a kitchen knife. You could make the lips smile permanently if you wanted to. He would show her when he let her out. He smiled at the cupboard door, listening to her moans. Detective Inspector Barrow had only just woken. He stood by the window, wearing a loose-fitting bathrobe, and gazed out at the fog. Abruptly, he turned away and walked towards the wardrobe. He took out his best suit and laid it carefully on the bed. Then he opened a drawer and took out a clean shirt, which he laid on top of the suit. He walked back to the wardrobe again and reached up into the high shelf inside and brought down his own private black museum of weapons used in various cases in which he had been involved. He studied its contents for a while and then removed one particular object. He replaced the lid and returned the box to its resting place. He went into the bathroom and shaved and washed. He dressed with some care, taking trouble over tying his tie. Then he shot himself. Chapter 18. Slowly, Homan opened his eyes and found himself in daylight, grey though it was. He could hear a strange voice speaking from a distance. Lifting his head slightly, he discovered he was lying in the road with the devastation vehicle on its back a few yards away from him. The voice coming from the open doorway to its cabin was the voice of the radio. This was demanding to know what.
He tried to lift himself and found he could, although it made him feel a little giddy. Mason! Where was Mason? Homan's senses were returning rapidly now, and he sat up. Mason lay a foot away, his face turned towards him, the eyes unseeing, the expression rigid. All Homan felt was despair. Just as he got to his feet, a car appeared from nowhere, screeching to a halt in front of him. Then round to the driver's door. He yanked it open and was about to haul its occupant out when the startled man said, "Oh, please, please let me go. I've got to get away from these lunatics." Homan hesitated. The man behind the wheel appeared to be in his early 40s. His eyes, although frightened, were not glazed. He said again, "Please let me go." "Get over," Homan commanded, pushing his way in. "You're not the same as the rest, are you?" the man asked nervously, as Homan put the car in gear. "As the rest?" Homan asked cautiously. "You know, mad. Everyone's gone mad. It's the fog. Please, please tell me you're okay, like me." "I'm sane," Homan said, wondering if he still was. Could anyone remain sane after all he'd been through? The man smiled. "Well, thank God for that," he said. "I thought I was the only one left. You've no idea what I've been through. My wife tried to kill me. It was horrible, horrible," he said brokenly. "She picked up the bread knife, and I saw her bringing the knife down. I was lucky. It caught my shoulder, and the blade snapped. We fought there over the breakfast things. She cracked her head, knocked herself out. I didn't know what to do." The body began to shake. The man was reliving the horror. "I tied her up. I was afraid of her, afraid of my own wife. She's always been so good, so gentle." "Did you make sure your wife was securely tied before you left her?" asked Homan. "Oh, I didn't leave her," the man replied. "There she is, my Louise, behind you in the back." Homan quickly glanced over his shoulder. On the back seat was slumped the bound figure of a woman, recognizable as a woman only by her clothes, for the body ended in a bloody stump at the neck, decapitated. A cry of horror escaped from Homan's lips, and he jammed his foot down hard on the brake pedal. The jolt threw the man forward, and Homan leaned across his back and shoved the door open. Still in one motion, he pushed the man out of the car and into the road. All he wanted was to get away, and he drove on. A black hole opened up ahead of him, and he suddenly found himself swallowed up by darkness. Once again his foot hit the brakes. When he looked back, he saw grey light flowing in from a high square arch about. Then he realized what had happened. He had driven a tunnel. Blackwall Tunnel, he said. To be. They'd been driving in that direction into the city through Aldgate down Commercial Road towards Poplar. Homan was in the old tunnel, the one used for access to the north. He would use it now and get to Westminster by following the river along its southern side. But he would have to get rid of the grotesque figure on the floor behind him. He got out and looked around in the back until he found the tied ankles. He pulled the body to the side of the tunnel, then straightened up and looked round. There seemed to be light coming from around a bend, but it couldn't be daylight. Before he drove any further into the tunnel, he would have to investigate. Cautiously, he began to walk down the tunnel towards the eerie light. It grew brighter at his approach, a strange, yellowish light. A familiar dread crept through him again. He began to suspect the source of the light. The acrid smell was growing stronger. Then he knew. The whole tunnel ahead was filled with the glow of the mutated mycoplasma. He had found it. Could it possibly have actually sought shelter like an animal searching for a lair? No, that was too ridiculous. And yet he had found it lurking inside the cathedral, and they'd lost it once before. Could it really have drifted accidentally into these man-made shelters? He stood gazing into its hypnotic shine for several minutes, and then backed away. By the time he got back to the car, an idea had formed in his mind. He jumped into the Ford and reversed it towards the entrance. Looking over his shoulder through the rear window, he saw a shadowy figure. It was the man he'd thrown from the car, and in his arms he cradled his dead wife. Chapter 19. Homan crouched in the dark shop, away from the eyes of the groups of lunatics roaming the streets, but positioned so that he could see the overturned devastation vehicle lying in the middle of the road. The fog seemed much clearer now, although the very air seemed to carry a yellow tinge to it. Homan had taken extreme care in driving back to the vehicle, for everything depended on his reaching the radio. He needed help from the base if he were to carry out his plan, and certain materials. His plan was simple. The mutated mycoplasma had been locked away below ground for many years, trapped by tons of earth. Now it had returned to another underground sanctuary, and this could be made into a prison if both ends
were sealed. So he had returned to the vehicle, and with relief found the radio still buzzing, and he'd used it to tell headquarters of his plan. He asked for explosives, as much as could be loaded into the second devastation vehicle, and also an explosives expert. He told them he was at a point along the East India Dock Road, close to a turning called Hale Street. He told them to hurry. 2 hours went by before the other devastation vehicle appeared. He left his hiding place in the shop, and he walked over to the second vehicle, just as a heavy-suited figure clambered out. "Well done, Mr. Holman," said the voice, familiar, although distorted by the helmet's speaker. He recognized the slight German accent. "Professor Riker?" he asked. "Yes," came the reply. "I decided to see the mutation firsthand before we sealed it off, and I must have that sample, for we still do not know exactly what the mutation is. So please, let us go to this tunnel. We must not waste any more time." They climbed into the vehicle and sat down. "This is Captain Peters, our explosives expert," said Riker, introducing them. "Sir," the captain said to Herman, "what happened to Mason?" Herman pointed to 2 dead road. "One of them's Mason. He was injured in the crash." "This is Sergeant Stanton," the captain introduced a second man. "Where are the explosives?" Herman asked. The small cabin was fairly cramped with all 4 of them, especially with the other 3's suits, making their bodies even more bulky. "You're sitting on most of it," said the sergeant. Then the captain said, "I think Mr. Holman should drive. He'll have a clearer view than any of us. We daren't take off these helmets now that the door is opened." Holman struggled into the driver's seat, and the vehicle moved off. "Of course, we still do not know if these suits are strong enough to resist the mycoplasma in its purest form," said Riker. "And that is why it is still you, Mr. Holman, who will have to draw off the sample." Holman shuddered as he drove. Soon, by carefully skirting likely trouble spots, they arrived at the black entrances to the twin tunnels. Holman stopped the vehicle, and the 4 clambered out. Then Riker said in surprise, "But there are 2 tunnels!" Holman nodded. "Yes, one is the old tunnel, the right-hand one, used by northbound traffic. The other, more recent one, is the south. The nucleus is in the old one." The 4 men walked into the entrance he indicated, 3 lumbering along, small oxygen tanks strapped to their backs, one unencumbered but looking humanly frail beside the others. Herman walked into the blackness for about 6 yards, then stood there, allowing his eyes to grow accustomed to the darkness. "It's still there," he said after a while. The 2 soldiers returned to the vehicle and unloaded a lead container mounted on wheels from its side, similar to the one Holman had used in Winchester, only bigger. The sergeant unstrapped a long length of flexible steel tubing, narrower at one end. He coiled it over his shoulder and followed the captain, who was leading the motorized container, back towards the tunnel's entrance. Riker said, "There's no need to go too near the nucleus. You have 60 yards of steel tubing that is just stiff enough for you to push into the mycoplasma, and by switching on the machine it will be sucked back into the container. I will come with you myself." "Take these with you, sir," the captain said, handing Holman a small oxygen tank and a torch. Holman slid the tank onto his shoulder. Switching on the torch, he took the arm of the mobile container in his other hand and said, "I'm ready, Professor." They walked down the slope of the tunnel towards the bend. As they followed the curve of the tunnel, Holman said, "You better stop here, Professor. The light's getting much stronger. I think the main body of the mycoplasma is just around the next bend." The light was dazzling as he reached the point of the bend. The sooner he had completed this task, get away, the better he would like it. He placed the mouthpiece of the oxygen cylinder over his mouth, for the acrid smell was becoming stronger, and then he began sliding the steel tube along the tunnel into the glowing mass ahead. It met no resistance, a fact that surprised Holman. He'd almost expected some kind of resilience, but he realized again it was an organism he was probing, millions of tiny microbes. He pressed the switch to start the suction unit, and the machine began to buzz and draw off the deadly mutation into its reinforced container. He was to leave it on for at least 3 minutes. It was a long 3 minutes before he switched off, pushed another button to seal the container, then detached the tubing. He stood up and looked into the radiance. Perhaps should get a closer look at it. He was immune, after all. It couldn't harm him. He began to walk towards it. When he had only gone 10 yards, Riker's gloved hand pulled him back. Homan could only stare at the darkened visor. "You shouldn't be this close, Riker. Your suit may not be enough protection," he said. I know, but you had to be stopped. Come along, let us get away from here." They collected the machine and made their way back to the tunnel's entrance. "Everything okay, sir?" inquired the captain, stepping forward to take the machine. "Everything is fine," Riker told him. "Now, take the container back out of harm's way. We will worry about loading it later." He looked at the arch of the tunnel and smiled inside his helmet. "It is very fortunate that they thought of building another tunnel. Captain Peters and I will take explosives through the southbound passage and plant them at the other end. We must seal both openings at the same time so that the mycoplasma will be trapped. We will time our blasts so that they occur simultaneously." They went over to the vehicle and the sergeant began to unload the explosives. The captain returned. "I put the container halfway up the incline," he said. "It'll be quite safe there for now. Nobody can move it unless they know how to operate it." He handed Homan a small two-way radio. "You take this, Mr. Homan, and you can speak to us while Sergeant Stanton is setting up his explosives," he said. "It should take us about 20 minutes to get through the tunnel and set ourselves up," the captain went on. "We'll radio through and synchronize our blasts that way. All set?" He turned towards Riker, who nodded, and they clambered into the vehicle, which moved off down towards the second entrance. Homan stood well back while the sergeant set his explosives 30 feet inside the tunnel. The radio crackled in Homan's hand. "Hello, can you hear me, Mr. Holman?" It was Riker's voice, sounding distant. Homan acknowledged. "The captain is inside the tunnel now," the voice went on. "How are things at your end?" "Sergeant Stanton is just running out the fuse. We should be ready at any time." Good. Tell the sergeant that one charge is near the roof and another at the bottom of the opposite wall." Homan told Stanton, who was now some distance away. He nodded and pointed at his chest. "The sergeant's done the same," Homan said into the mouthpiece. Good. Now we must find cover." The radio went dead. Homan and Sergeant Stanton climbed the parapet and waited. The voice of Peters came on the air. "Right, we'll give it a countdown of 1 minute. Ready on the stroke of 60. Good luck, and keep your bloody heads down." The radio went again. Homan felt the whooshing of air before he heard the explosion, sweeping his hair back, dragging at his clothes. Then he heard a roar, muffled at first, then developing into a loud, rumbling crack of thunder. He expected to feel fragments of rubble descending upon them, but none came. "Nice clean one, that," said the sergeant, looking towards the entrance. Homan managed to smile at what he saw. Broken rubble had completely filled the high entrance. He picked up the radio. "Hello, Professor Riker," he said into it. "Quite a blast, came the reply. "Well, it's done the job at this end. How about your side?" "It's completely sealed at this end." Excellent. Then his voice broke off. "There's a gap." Homan started at the sudden exclamation. "Gott! There's a light! The hole is beginning to glow. The mycoplasma is escaping. I must get away from here." And the radio went dead. Homan, can you hear me?" Homan made a grab for the radio. He'd no idea of how much time had elapsed since the receiver had gone dead. "This is Homan," he said hastily. "Riker?" "No, this is Captain Peters. Professor Riker's beside me. I don't think he's too good. What happened?" "The mycoplasma got loose. It must have passed right over the professor." Homan said slowly, "Is he all right?" "He seems sort of dazed." "Be careful," Homan urged. "He may have been infected." "No, I think it's just shock. These suits are pretty bloody tough. Anyway, I'm following the thing." Then came an agonizing silence.
Homan, there are 2 giant gas holders in front of us. The voice broke in again. Homan's mind raced back to the occasions he had used the 3-lane motorway leading from the Blackwall Tunnel and the vast gas refinery beside the river.
Holman, what is this place?
It was Riker. Professor, are you okay? Asked Holman.
A little dizzy, but otherwise fine. Now, what is this place ahead?
Holman told him all he knew of the huge gasworks and how, if necessary, they could get into it.
I think it is necessary, the voice came back. The nucleus is making straight for it. We are close to the holders now, and there is a gate ahead. We will go through. I can see the nucleus. It is nestled between the 2 gas holders like a tiny child between 2 monstrous parents.
He sounded almost whimsical. Then he went on.
Do you know what town gas is, Mr. Holman? Well, let me tell you. It is a toxic mixture of hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and hydrocarbons. Furthermore, it contains ammonia, sulfur, hydrocyanic acid, benzene, and other substances. In other words, a highly combustible mixture. I think the mutation has provided us with another answer. Don't you agree, Mr. Holman?
The radio went dead again. My God, thought Holman, he means to blow the tanks up, and the mutated mycoplasma with them. But what sort of damage would an explosion of that force do? But he was right. It was worth the risk. Holman scrambled to his feet. He would cross the river through the tunnel that was still intact and help the 2 on the other side. He looked around for Sergeant Stanton and found the mob were at work. 50 yards away, crazed people with a grey-clad figure high into the air and letting it drop to the ground with bone thuds. They'd got the sergeant. Holman was on his own again. He hurried into the tunnel that was still intact, praying that the crowd hadn't seen him. As he emerged from the other end, the radio crackled into life again. "Captain Peters here. Can you hear me?" "Holman here," he replied. "What's happening?" "I've put as much explosive as I beneath each. They'll crack like eggs. I'll set the timer for 5 minutes, which will give us time to get under cover." He went on. "Here comes Riker now. I think he's still in a state of shock. 1 minute he's quite rational, the next he seems to go off into My God!" Holman heard the captain calling out Professor Riker's name, then the radio went dead. After a minute or 2, Captain Peters came through again. His words carried an edge of panic. He's grabbed the detonator box, and he's walking back now into the fog, into the nucleus. Holman, get into the tunnel if you can. I'm coming out. I'm beside the vehicle. I may just have a chance." Static. Then silence. Then 2 things happened at the same time. The mob poured from the tunnel below, carrying a bloodied, naked carcass above their heads, and as he turned their way, a searing flash followed by a deafening explosion, and then in turn followed by a thunderous whoosh of exploding gas, rocked the very earth. Holman curled up into a tight ball, trying to make himself as small as possible. He was afraid to look, for he knew the world above him was now a blazing inferno, and the heat would scorch his eyes. He was luckier than the people at the tunnel's exit. They were burnt to death instantly by the scorching blast of dry air. It was a long, long time before Holman had to uncover his head from his blistered hands and look. The whole area before him seemed to be a gigantic ball of flame, with sudden bursts of yellow flame among the deeper orange and red billowing fire. A few hundred yards away he could see the shell of the devastation vehicle, almost completely burnt out now. He closed his aching eyes. The sergeant, Peters, Professor Riker. What a terrible price to pay. He knew the mutation was gone, destroyed by the intense heat, the enemy and the ally of mankind. But at the moment, all Holman wanted was to rest.
A sudden rush of colder air stirred him from his apathy, and he looked again. As the fire rose into the air, the fog rose with it, soaring upwards with the flames. Holman sat back against the wall, his hands hanging loosely over his raised knees, staring into the sky, waiting for the first clear blue patch to appear. Holman had found his way back to the underground car park. He had told them where the lead container with the sample was, and of all that had happened, of the journey through the city, the death of Mason, the sealing off of the Black Wall Tunnel, the final destruction of the mycoplasma with the destruction of the gas plant. They had congratulated him, praised him. But he had told them it was Professor Riker and Captain Peters who had finally destroyed the disease. When he had heard that the whole town was going to be sprayed with sleeping gas, he had begged Janet Halstead for a shot of something that would keep his fatigued body going so that he could reach Casey. They had promised him that the spraying operation would leave the area in which he lived till last, and they had given him the use of an army scout car. As he drove from the underground shelter, the drug was already beginning to revitalize his exhausted system. Even as he climbed the stairs to his flat, Holman could hear the low-flying aircraft in the distance spewing out their life-saving sleeping gas. First, the population of London would sleep. Then blood transfusions would be given, followed by radiology to burn out the bad brain cells. Many were going to be all right again. The door to his flat was firmly closed. He pounded on it with his fist, and he breathed a sigh of relief when Casey let him in. He pushed past her into the hall and kicked the door with the heel of his foot, and then he pulled her to him fiercely. She broke away to look at him, and her eyes instantly clouded with anxiety. "John, what's happened to you? What have they done to you?" she asked. "It's a long story," he said wearily. "But the worst is over for us now, darling," he told her, holding her close. "When this is finally finished, when they've done all they can for those who've been harmed, the people are going to find out exactly how it happened. I'm going to make sure of that. But now, Casey, we're going to sleep. We're going to lie down together and drift into a long, long sleep." His arm round her, they walked towards his bedroom, his tired and aching body leaning on hers for support, and closed the door behind them. Overhead, Holman heard the hum of the low-flying aircraft and knew they had reached his sector.